Okay. Hey, Michael. How you doing?
I still, I do, I do this thing. I still on my shirt.
Did let's talk about this painting. Who made this painting?
Michael.
You made it. Michael made
I
it.
still on my shirt.
What happened?
I still pee on my shirt.
Did you spill paint all over your shirt?
Yes, I did.
Oh my goodness. You spilled paint all over your shirt while you made it. Hey, Michael, what is this? Can you tell me what is that?
It's a circle.
It's a circle.
I fell on my shirt.
You spilled paint on your shirt while you made it? But what but what is this? What is this painting?
It's a circle.
It's a circle. I don't think it looks like a circle.
It's like a scary guy.
It's a scary guy? Ooh.
I got signs.
Ooh. Michael, tell me what this painting is.
I make it that I show him a shirt. Bye.
Don't turn off the video just yet. Don't turn it off just yet. Michael, I'm looking at this painting up here, and I don't see any clear form. I don't see any clear subject. I mean, if a Renaissance artist painter looked at this, I don't think they'd think that much of it. I don't think if a neoclassical artist looked at this, I don't think that artist would think that much of this. Or a Baroque artist or Rococo, they wouldn't think that much of this. But you know who might think a lot of this painting? A modernist painter. No form, all color, expressionism, impressionism. I think one of those types of artists would like this type of painting. And that's what we're going to learn about today. Hey, Michael, come here. Come here. Say hi to the Eurobears. Say hi, Eurobears.
Bye, Bear.
Don't say bye. Say hi.
Hi.
Say hi, Eurobears.
Hi, you Bear.
The Eurobears are going to learn about modernism today. Can you say modernism? All right. There we go. We're going to learn about modernism. Okay, now you can press the red dot. Now you can press the red dot. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Let's learn about modernism. Press the red dot. All right, AP European History students, this is the recorded lecture on modernism. Modernism is an artistic and philosophical and cultural movement that encompasses quite a bit of time. We can mark its beginnings in the middle of the 19th century, and we can take it all the way through to at least the middle of the 20th century, and probably beyond. It's a complicated topic, but it's also a fun topic, so there's a lot to cover here. Let's get to it. As complicated as modernism is, one way to understand it is as by placing it into an historical context and seeing it as yet another result of the ideas of this individual, Charles Darwin. Because Charles Darwin, when he comes around and he publishes his book on the origin of species in the year 1859, it changes the way we think about ourselves as human beings, and this has an immense cultural impact, and this will be reflected in the arts and in philosophy and in various other forms of study. Darwin's ideas impacted much more than just biology. So one of the ways we can understand the impact of Darwin's ideas on the arts and philosophy and all that after 1859 is to place it into contrast with how people thought about themselves prior to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. So before Darwin came along, for most human beings, we were something very special. We were something very unique. We were above the animal kingdom. We were superior to the animal kingdom because we were Homo sapiens. We were creatures that think. We have consciousness. We have awareness. We have some sense of right and wrong, which in the minds of most people prior to Darwin placed us closer to God than the animal kingdom. So think about this in terms of, well, imagine yourself in contrast to your pet. So let's say you have a pet dog or a pet cat or a pet fish or something like this. And if you don't have a pet, just imagine that you do. Think to yourself, what makes me different from that other animal? Well, you have consciousness, you have awareness. You can place yourself on a continuum of time. You know what you were doing yesterday, you can plan for tomorrow. And even though that pet is a wonderful, wonderful thing, prior to Darwin's theory, for most people, not all, but for most people, there was a sense of superiority for how we human beings related to our pets and the rest of the animal kingdom. We're superior. We can do math and science and build buildings, invent the steam engine and all this other stuff. We're superior. And then along comes Charles Darwin, and it really forces people to question all that, because now there's a sense that, well, even if we think we're superior, that superiority came from us being animals too. We are animals, we are part of the animal kingdom, we're not separate from it. And so even our highest of cognitive functions is the product of evolution by means of natural selection. Now, I think how most people think about evolution has changed over the course of time, over the past 150, 200 years. Not quite 200, but we're getting close to it. And I do think back in the 19th century, there's still a very clear sense that we humans are superior to the animal kingdom. But that superiority came from vicious competition, and we rose to the top. I don't know if Charles Darwin necessarily ever saw it like that. I don't think he did. I mean, for example, when Charles Darwin studied ants and he looked at the complexity of ants and he dissected an ant, I have no clue how you dissect an ant. Seems like that'd be a very difficult thing to do with really small knives. But he found an ant brain and he was astounded by how complex an ant brain is given its size, and that it must be superior to a human brain, which is much bigger, given all the things that an ant can do. And so I guess I'm bringing up this point because I don't know if Darwin actually thought that we were these superior creatures, but I do think a lot of people at this time in the 19th century took his theory to justify their superiority, both as human beings and then as white people and then as white European men. They sort of saw themselves as at the top of the pecking order because of all this competition, this struggle for survival. Now I think today most biologists, they look at human beings as simply having evolved to their environment in the same way that a squirrel has evolved to adapt to its environment, in the same way that a platypus has evolved to adapt to its environment, and that there's sort of an equality among the species. We've all just found different ways to adapt to our different environment. But all that said, people after Darwin start thinking about themselves differently. We're not separate from the animal kingdom. In fact, we are animals, and that natural selection is a law of nature in the same way that gravity is a law of nature, and it affects all of us and everything that we're doing. So you remember that Karl Marx was influenced by Charles Darwin. Karl Marx, like Darwin, did not believe in any special spiritual forces in the world, but rather there's only materialism, there's only stuff, and that there's a struggle for survival and there's evolution. And of course, as Karl Marx saw things, humanity is evolving towards a state of first capitalism, then socialism, then eventually communism. Okay, so now let's talk about the impact of Charles Darwin and the historical events of the mid-19th century and how it influenced art and literature, and then I'll also talk about philosophy too. Okay, so if you look at your slide right here, I have two terms for you. The first is realism and the second is naturalism. Realism and naturalism are pretty much the same thing, with the exception of realism applies to the art of the mid-19th century and sometimes late 19th century, and naturalism applies to the literature of that same time period, mostly mid and then into the late 19th century. Realism and naturalism were both artistic movements of the mid to late 19th century, and these art movements focused on capturing the grimy reality of existence, stripping away any idealism. One way that we, students of history, can understand realism and naturalism is as an outcome or a consequence of the failure of the 1848 revolutions, as a failure of utopian socialism, and as an end to romanticism. So instead of looking at life as this beautiful, wonderful thing where all of us have value, where nature is wonderful, the realists in the art world and the naturalists in the literature world, they want to talk about how rough and difficult life is. They want to present as realistically as possible. Here's what life is actually like. So think of it like this. Since you are a teenager in high school right now, you have seen representations of teenagers in high school in television shows and in movies, right? And as you look at those representations of teenagers in movies and film, ask yourself, how accurate is that representation? Or is this film or TV show romanticizing or idealizing what it is like to actually be a teenager in high school in the 21st century? And depending upon what you're thinking about right now, you might think, yes, what I've seen in like a particular show or movie, that's accurate. It captures how I feel. But then you might think of an example of, no, not at all. We don't look like that. We don't act like that. We don't talk like that. We're either being made a caricature of, or they are romanticizing what it's like to be a teenager in a high school at this point in time in history. So if you had to make your own TV show or your own movie about what life is actually like, and you want to get into the grimy reality of what it's like to be a teenager in high school from day to day to day, well, what would your TV show or movie look like? Stripping away all pretense, all idealism, all romantic notions of what it's like. Well, if you tried to do that, you would be a realist or a naturalist. All right, so here is Gustave Courbet. He is the one and only realist painter that I'm going to talk about. He was French, of course. And here is what I think is probably the greatest self-portrait of any painter in European history. Just Courbet looking at us with those wild eyes, running his fingers through his hair. I know nothing about the context of this particular self-portrait other than, man, it's captivating to look at. So Courbet, great quote from Courbet that really just summarizes all of naturalism and all of realism. And Courbet's quote is this: "Let us be true even if we are ugly." So Courbet wants to paint reality as it actually is, no idealism, no romanticism. So here's an example of that. His 1849 work, The Stonebreakers. Here you have an older man, here you have a much younger man, and they are working in a quarry breaking stone. Their clothes are ripped and tattered. You got the man breaking the rocks, and the younger man muscling up his strength to get that basket of rocks up on his knee that he has to carry to, who knows where. There's not much that's pleasant about this painting. It's celebrating hard work, manual labor. And I don't think there's too much joy that many people can take out of this particular painting. It's just the griminess and the difficulty of everyday life. So why would you ever want to put a piece of artwork like this up in a museum for people to look at? Well, because Courbet and the other realists would argue, this is truth. This is truth. Everything else you're getting is lies. All right, so The Stonebreakers by Courbet. Hey, in an important year too for The Stonebreakers, 1849, right? So after the 1848 revolutions, and 1849 was the year of the conservative resurgence, although not quite yet in Courbet's France. That doesn't happen, of course, until the full collapse of the French Second Republic in 1852. All right, naturalism. All naturalism is the same as realism, but as applied to literature. And perhaps the greatest of all of the naturalist writers was another Frenchman, a man by the name of Émile Zola. Émile Zola grew up in rural France, and he had a good friend growing up named Paul Cézanne, who will be another very famous person in the late 19th century. And both Zola and Cézanne came to Paris. Zola wanted to be a writer, Cézanne wanted to be a painter, and they both ended up being wildly successful in their own ways, although Cézanne ended up being anything but a realist painter. Zola goes on to become probably the most significant, most influential, most famous naturalist writers in European history. He'll also get involved in politics, and we'll learn more about Zola in a future lecture. Okay, so let me talk about Émile Zola's probably greatest work. He wrote a lot. He was a very famous author. He wrote quite a few books. This, I would argue, was his most famous. I don't have a date for it. It was published in the year 1885. I don't have a date on the screen, but there it is. It's 1885. The title of this work was called Germinal. The image that you see here is from the French film, Germinal, which came out, I don't know, sometime in the early 90s. So I'd like to take a few minutes here to talk about Germinal because it is one of these great works of European literature that you should know about. Okay, so first of all, its name. The word Germinal comes from the French Revolutionary Calendar, from the First French Revolution. So if you remember, in the middle of the 1790s, in order to completely break from the past, the French Revolutionary government, during the Convention years, they created a new calendar. Germinal is the word for springtime. So we English-speaking people can see the word germinate in the word germinal. This means things are coming alive, things are growing. So germinal. Now probably what Zola's intent was in choosing that word for this particular book was to symbolize the people are rising up. This is a revolutionary word. It also represents springtime, things coming alive, things coming into bloom. And this is a story about a strike, a miners' strike in northern France. And so this image of people rising up in this revolutionary fervor, this feeling of coming alive, is likely why he titled this book Germinal. Okay, so what is Germinal about? So Germinal is about a miners' strike. There were many coal mines in northern France and also in Belgium. It's an area that is rich in coal. And the story begins with this man who shows up from out of town and he's looking for a job. And he gets a job working in one of these coal mines. He gets to know the men who work there and the women who work there, their families, what their lives are like, the tight communities that they have. And he also starts to learn about their suffering, their physical suffering. Some of them are really sick with black lung, having spent so much time in the mines. Their financial suffering, how they barely have enough to make ends meet. And then the lack of regard that the owners of the mines have for their own workers. And so there's these other scenes in Germinal that juxtapose the suffering of the miners, where Zola takes you into the homes of the owners of the mines and just how nice and bucolic and pleasant these families have it in their homes, and they have no clue of the suffering of the men who are working in the mines, which is where they get all their money for all their stuff. There's just this complete disconnect between the lives of the rich and the lives of the poor. So the new guy who shows up from out of town organizes a strike. He convinces the workers, we're not going to go down into the mines, we're going to strike for better wages, wages that we can live on. And the miners are at such a point of desperation that they decide to join in and strike. Now, one guy who encourages the miners not to strike is a bartender. So all these miners go to a bar after they're done with their shift to have a beer before they go home with their families or go home to be with their families. And so everybody knows the barkeep. And this bartender says, don't do this. The rich are never going to listen to you. You know, the rich will work with the government. They'll get soldiers out here to guard the mines, and they'll bring in scabs. They'll take your jobs, and then you'll really be desperate. Bartender says strikes don't work. What he recommends is, flat out, killing the rich. It just says kill the rich, or find the rich, kill them. Take the mines, blow them up. That's the only way to get rich people to listen to you. Strikes, too ineffective. Terrorism. That's what's effective. So this bartender represents this sort of Mikhail Bakunin radical anarchist type who believes that the situation is so desperate that the only way forward is to kill the rich. So then what goes down is this. The strike is on. Troops were called in. There is a confrontation between the striking miners and the soldiers. Shots are fired. Miners are killed. The strike goes on. Eventually, the strikers are now truly starving. They don't have the ability to continue to strike in this war of attrition for who can last longer. The strikers not working, not getting paid, or the wealthy who own the mines, who are waiting for the strikers to essentially just starve. And so they come crawling back in desperation. Please give me a job. I'll work for anything. And in the end, the strikers give in, the strike is a failure, and the men go down into the mines, completely heartbroken, especially after some of their close friends have died. Germinal is not a happy novel, by the way, guys. Hopefully getting a sense of this. So when they go back into the mines, that bartender guy says, don't go back into the mines. Don't go back on this particular day. And the miner's like, we have to. We've got no money left. We have to go back to work. And the miner says, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't go down into the mines. And the reason why the bartender is saying this is because he's gotten some dynamite. He's planning on blowing up the mines. And he does. He blows up the mines. He tried to warn the guys not to go down into the mines, but they did anyways. So the mines collapse with the men down in the bowels of the earth. So now, are the owners of the mines going to launch this massive and expensive rescue operation to save these guys? Or are they just going to go, well, okay, these are the hazards of the profession. And clearly somebody wanted to blow up the mine. So now we're going to let those guys just stay down there and die. And so now the scene of this novel shifts to underground, where these miners are trapped and nobody's going to rescue them. And then it becomes this horrible struggle for survival. Some of the men start fighting each other. There was a woman down there. One of the men loved her. Other men are trying to sexually assault her. The man who loves her is trying to defend her. And what we see happen is these human beings have been reduced to barbarism given their situation. So what happens to the men who are trapped underground and the woman that's trapped underground? Well, I usually spoil these books. I'm not going to spoil this one. If you want to know, read Germinal. But I think I've done a good job of giving you a fair overview of this book. This is a book about a miners' strike, and it reveals how human beings are nothing but animals, vicious animals. Doesn't matter if you're rich or if you're poor. There's a struggle for survival, and life is harsh. Life is harsh. This is not an uplifting book. It's also a book that if you read it, it makes you really hate rich people. The first AP European History teacher conference that I went to when I was first starting to teach this course in the summer of 2011, I was hanging out with European history teachers when we were talking about this book, because one of the teachers actually has his students read this book, which is a pretty big work to read. It's 500 pages long. It's a long book. And so first of all, we're talking about the merits of teaching this book. And then we got into a conversation joking about how this book turns all of its readers into Marxists. It's hard to read this book and not start to become sympathetic to communism, because the rich they don't, and the owners of the mines, they do not care about their workers at all, to the point that they're willing to let them die so that they can simply make money. And then Zola shows the families of the owners of the mines, and these people are they live these happy lives, and they're completely oblivious to the suffering that's happening right down the road with the working class families. This book is definitely designed to inspire anger in the readers. And it's really a cry for economic and social justice. All right, so there it is, Émile Zola's Germinal, a great example of naturalism. So there's realism, there's naturalism. They were big in sort of the mid to early late 19th century, so 1850s, 1860s, Germinal is 1880s, and there'll be other naturalist and realist painters and writers going into the 20th century. But while those movements are going on, this movement is developing, the movement of modernism. So what is modernism? All right, modernism was an artistic movement of the late 19th through 20th centuries that aimed to break from all classical and traditional forms. So to repeat myself, it was an artistic movement of the late 19th through the 20th centuries that aims to break from all classical and traditional forms. So what's that mean? Modernism is hard to define. It's really hard to define, and I'm going to give you a definition from a historian here in a second that should help you to understand modernism a little bit better. But really, modernism is, as best as I can explain it, it's a rejection. It's a rejection of anything that came before. Modernism, the spirit of modernism, is taking what was good and right from the past and turning it on its head. So for example, if there was something in the past that was considered to be beautiful, like for example, Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, if that was considered to be beautiful in the past, now that's going to be considered ugly. And what was once considered ugly is now going to be considered beautiful. That's modernism. It's just simply a challenge to everything that came before. Okay, so that's my sort of cheap overview of modernism. Here's a real historian. Peter Gay, who just passed away, fairly recently in 2015. He's a German-American cultural historian. You may look at his last name and be like, oh, that doesn't sound very German, the word gay. He was born Peter Froelich, a Jew in Germany, and was a refugee from Nazi Germany. He came over here to the United States in the late 1930s, I believe, 1939, and he changed his last name Froelich, which means happy or gay in German, and just anglicized his last name to Gay. So Peter Gay. Peter Gay is a great historian. He wrote a two-volume monumental work on the history of the Enlightenment. He also wrote a big biography on Sigmund Freud, who's an individual we'll be learning about here later in the lecture, and he also wrote a big book on modernism. Now, if you can look at the subtitle of this book, this is Peter Gay's definition of modernism. He simply defines modernism as the lure of heresy. The lure of heresy. So the lure is a temptation, right? It is something that you are being enticed to do. And heresy is something that is contrary to a particular doctrine. We tend to think of this in a religious context. A heretic is somebody who is, well, disobedient to a particular religion. So the lure of heresy, the temptation, the enticement to do what's bad. So that's how Peter Gay defines modernism. And if it's good enough for Peter Gay, it's good enough for me. And if you look at the cover of this book, the subtitle is From Baudelaire to Beckett and Beyond. Some nice alliteration there. But for Peter Gay, the very first modernist was a French poet named Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire lived a short but wild life. This man died in his 40s, and as I looked at this particular portrait of Baudelaire, that looks like a man who is older than his 40s, but is not, probably because of the extreme damage he did to his body in his wild living. And his most important work is a collection of poetry called Les Fleurs du Mal. Excuse me, Les Fleurs du Mal. And Les Fleurs du Mal is translated as either the flowers of evil or the flowers of sickness. And in Les Fleurs du Mal, Baudelaire wants to take what was once considered to be beautiful and good and turn that beautiful and good into what is ugly and bad. And he wants to take what was previously ugly and bad and turn that into what is beautiful and good. And we get a sense of this in the opening lines of Les Fleurs du Mal, in which he writes to the reader, folly, depravity, greed, mortal sin, invade our souls and rack our flesh. We feed our gentle guilt, gracious regrets that breed like vermin glutting on foul beggar's skin. So this book of poetry, which is pre-Darwin, by the way, Baudelaire wants to take us out of the comfort of a nice home, and he sort of wants to shove us into a back, dark, nasty, grimy alleyway and have us live there for a little while. Be sick, do bad things. Don't live a life of comfort. Live in the grime, and then you'll feel the joy of being alive. That's Baudelaire, a fantastic example of modernism, and the individual who historian Peter Gay identifies as the first modernist. All right, and here's our next great modernist. He's also a Frenchman. His name was Marcel Proust, and talk about somebody who spent his life living in the grime. Proust certainly didn't have a happy life. He struggled throughout most of his life, but as much as he may have struggled emotionally and socially, he did produce a multi-volume epic work, which is considered to be one of the greatest works of literature in the history of humanity. You've got a screenshot of this particular work here. You can see all 6 volumes of it, which is it's collectively known as In Search of Lost Time. If I can practice my French here, I believe it's called in French, and pardon me if I screw this up, if you know French better than I do, La Recherche du Temps Perdu. It's about as best as I can do. Sorry about that if you speak French for real. All right, In Search of Lost Time. It's this multi-volume work that explores the relationship between consciousness and memory. So consciousness, how your mind is processing thoughts, your mind's awareness of yourself, your concept of yourself, and how those things relate to your memories. So Proust came up with the idea of In Search of Lost Time from a particular experience that he had eating Madeleine cookies and sipping tea. And he writes about this in the first volume of In Search of Lost Time, which is called Swann's Way. And In the novel and in real life, Proust had this experience, and this experience goes something like this. Now, I've never read In Search of Lost Time. I've never actually read the passage where he talks about this, or at least I've not read the whole book. But here's in short what happens. On one particular day, Marcel Proust sat down and he began eating Madeleine cookies and sipping tea. And while he was doing this seemingly inane act, he all of a sudden was hit with a flood of memories. Memories of being a young boy with his aunt, who also used to feed him Madeleine cookies and tea. So he has this sensory experience in the present, which ignites in him all of these memories of his past. And that experience serves as the foundation for the rest of In Search of Lost Time. Okay, so what's the big idea here? The idea in Proust's work is that your consciousness, the way your mind works, is actually this tapestry of your experiences in the present and the memories of your past. So as you're sitting here right now listening to this lecture, you're taking in all of this sensory information, sitting here listening to me and my awful voice, maybe looking at this screen of Proust and his Madeleine cookies, but also with you right now are memories and thoughts of the past, and those memories and thoughts of the past are playing into how you're interpreting your current experience. So Proust is beginning to explore through literature how our minds work, how we think, how we process information, what our consciousness is. And we will find that this is going to be a very common theme among the modernist writers. If you're looking at your screen right now, this is just an image I found, which is clearly from a graphic novel about Marcel Proust in Search of Lost Time, where he is sipping his tea and eating the Madeleine cookie and having this incredible moment which combines both sensory information from the present, which ignites this powerful memory from his childhood. Okay, so there's Marcel Proust. Moving on to our next modernist writer. Here is the English writer Virginia Woolf. She lived from 1882 to 1941. She is an extraordinarily important writer in the history of literature. Her first major work was published in 1927, and it was called To the Lighthouse. To the Lighthouse is an amazing piece of literature. It is also a rather complicated work to read because Virginia Woolf begins to abandon punctuation. And she abandons punctuation to create a new type of literature, or rather a new way of writing to express the inner experiences of her characters. So this sounds very similar to Proust. She really wants to get into the human mind and how our mind experiences the present. Okay, so To the Lighthouse. The title actually works nicely in terms of explaining the actual plot of the book. Now, what we find with the modernist writers is plot is not as significant as sort of the inner drama of the characters. But insofar as there is a plot in To the Lighthouse, this is it. The novel To the Lighthouse opens with a family discussing whether or not they are going to take a family trip to a lighthouse. Like they're going to have this afternoon excursion and go to a lighthouse. Now, what makes To the Lighthouse a little bit of a challenge to read as you get into it for the first time is that Virginia Woolf abandons quotation marks. So it becomes difficult to discern what is being said and what is being thought. So you can think about this within like your own family. Like imagine your own family sitting around the table having dinner together and you're talking about whatever. It doesn't matter. You could be talking about something totally silly like, I don't know, instead of going to the lighthouse, maybe going to your grandparents that weekend. You know, is everybody able to go to grandparents on Sunday? Is everybody's schedules clear for Sunday so that we can go to grandma and grandpa's? But as you're having this seemingly inane discussion, you know, especially in the case of families, that there's this psychodrama that exists between all of the characters. So there's you and your parents and your siblings, and sometimes you like each other and sometimes you don't like each other. And so as you're speaking your words, there's what you're saying, and then there's what you're processing in your mind as you're saying it. So you might be saying, yeah, I can go to grandma's on Sunday, Mom. But you might be thinking, oh, Mom, I don't like you right now. I don't want to spend a half a day in the car with you. You knew my friends had something going on Sunday, which is why you intentionally chose Sunday to go to grandma's. You could be thinking something like that. So you can imagine then taking it back to Virginia Woolf's work to the lighthouse, as this family is sitting around discussing whether or not they should take a trip to the lighthouse, how complicated and strange it is if you remove the quotation marks and you just have people saying things and thinking things and it's all jumbled up together. But what she's capturing is how we all think, because it's all going on in our heads at the same time. So this is why Virginia Woolf, and in particular her first novel, To the Lighthouse, was considered to be a groundbreaking literary work, but it's only one of the first great novels that Virginia Woolf writes in her lifetime. Aside from just exploring the inner life of characters, Virginia Woolf does spend a lot of time in her novels addressing concepts of gender in her novels as well. I don't have a screen for this, but one of the most interesting works, in my opinion, that Virginia Woolf wrote was a novel called Orlando. And Orlando is a character who seemingly is reborn throughout various stages of time in history, or various periods of time in history. And sometimes Orlando is a man, and sometimes Orlando is a woman. But throughout it all, Orlando is Orlando. There is some semblance of self. But like To the Lighthouse, Orlando is not an easy read. Probably one of the most important works of nonfiction that Virginia Woolf wrote, and one that is frequently quoted in AP European history books, is this: A Room of One's Own. So this particular work of nonfiction was actually taken from a series of lectures that Virginia Woolf did at Cambridge University in England, in which she addresses the role of the female writer. And she gets kind of interesting and spiritual in these lectures, which is very similar to kind of the feel of her books. So try to stay with me with this. Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, talks about how Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, had a sister. But nobody knows anything about this woman, or this girl actually, because she died at a fairly young age. No biographer has ever written about Shakespeare's sister. Shakespeare's sister died at a young age, and she's now buried on some random street corner in London, England. And Virginia Woolf says that even though this girl never got to grow up or write anything on her own, she is still a poet. And, says Virginia Woolf, she is still alive. So let me actually read the words of Virginia Woolf here as she talks about Shakespeare's sister. Virginia Woolf wrote, or I guess originally she said it, Virginia Woolf said, "Now my belief is that this poet, who never wrote a word and was buried at the crossroads, still lives. She lives in you and in me, and in many other women who are not here tonight, for they are washing up the dishes and putting the children to bed. But she lives. For the great poets do not die. They are continuing presences. They need only the opportunity to walk among us in the flesh. This opportunity, as I think, it is now coming within your power to give her. For my belief is that if we live another century or so, I'm talking of the common life, which is the real life, and not the little separate lives which we live as individuals. And if we have 500 pounds of income a year, and if we have a room of our own, if we have the habit of freedom and the courage to write exactly what we think, if we escape a little from the common sitting room and see human beings not always in their relation to each other, but in relation to reality, and the sky too, and the trees, or whatever it may be in themselves, if we face the fact, for it is a fact, that there is no arm to cling to, but that we go alone, and that our relation is to the world of reality, and not only to the world of men and women, then the opportunity will come, and the dead poet, who was Shakespeare's sister, will put on the body which she has so often laid down." Okay, so those are the words of Virginia Woolf. And it's a short but complicated passage filled with sort of this deep spirituality, which is worth explaining for just a minute here. Virginia Woolf is telling us that Shakespeare had a sister. She died. She died at a young age. But her spirit still lives. She is this unsung heroine from the history of literature. But just because she didn't write or publish anything or died at a young age didn't mean that she didn't have the words and the spirit of a poet. So, Virginia Woolf goes on to say, Shakespeare's sister lives in us. And she's addressing women. So Virginia Woolf is saying, us women. We carry within us Shakespeare's sister. And what we need to release Shakespeare's sister is, and here's the title of the work, a room of our own. A place where we can be separate from the demands of society, a place where we can be in touch with our inner self. And once we have this room of our own, which Virginia Woolf hints at, we need freedom, we need an income in order to have our own place so we're not beholden upon a man to provide these things for us. Once we have this room of our own, then we can get in touch with our inner selves. And within our inner self is this sort of eternal female poet who lives inside of us, Shakespeare's sister. And we can release her. And with our own literature, we can then shape culture and history and the world. Okay, so there's a lot there. That's Virginia Woolf. She's an incredible thinker. She's an incredible writer. Certainly was an innovative writer at the dawn of the 20th century. Virginia Woolf. And hey, something completely anecdotal. When I was in college in the early 1990s, there was this rather obscure alternative rock band of two women, and they called themselves, the name of their band was Shakespeare's Sister, which of course came from this particular work from Virginia Woolf. Wonder whatever happened to Shakespeare's sister. I don't know. Have to look him up. Moving on. Here's another great, monumental modernist writer from the early 20th century. He was Irish. His name was James Joyce. He lived from 1882 to 1941, which are the exact same years that Virginia Woolf lived. So these two lives overlapped perfectly. James Joyce was Irish, but he spent actually very little of his life in Ireland. James Joyce obviously loved Ireland. I believe all of his novels are set in Dublin, Ireland. I'm no Joyce expert, so I can't say that with 100% certitude, but two of his novels that I'm going to talk about are based in Dublin. The first is Dubliners, one of his earlier works, which is a series of short stories, each of which explores the inner life of a resident of Dublin, Ireland. Now, my own experience with reading Dubliners was this. Each chapter is a short story, right? And as I read each chapter, I couldn't just read one chapter and then move on to the next. I had to read each chapter twice because the first time you read it, you don't really know what's going on. I mean, maybe some readers can figure out what's going on. I certainly couldn't figure out what was going on the first time through. It's not like there's a clear plot. There's a lot of internal mental dialogue. It's very impressionistic, but I make my way through one chapter, and when I get done with that chapter, I'll go back and I'll reread that chapter, and then I get it. I start seeing things. Pieces start coming together. I'm like, oh, here's the story. So it's like there is a plot, but it's buried underneath all of these thoughts and experiences that each character is having. For me, and I think for many people who read Dubliners, the greatest chapter is the last one. It's a chapter called The Dead. It's a very, very long chapter that explores concepts of life and death. So there's a brief overview of Dubliners. So James Joyce, going back to sort of what I was originally saying before I started talking about Dubliners, he clearly loved Ireland because he wrote so much about it. But as a young man, he ran away from Ireland. He was disgusted by the oppressiveness and what he saw as the oppressiveness and the hypocrisy of the Roman Catholic Church and how he felt that corrupted people in Ireland. So James Joyce ran away. The favorite place for the modernist to hang out in the early 20th century is Paris, France. So James Joyce spends a lot of time living and writing in Paris, France. Even though he writes these incredible stories about Dublin and the rest of Ireland that are very detailed. I mean, in Dubliners and throughout his other works, he talks about, specific street corners and exactly what you can see there in Dublin, Ireland. So he clearly had a very powerful memory for what Ireland was like as he wrote about it, even when he was in a completely different country. James Joyce only wrote a handful of books, but each one seemed to be a little bit longer and also a little bit weirder than the last. So I enjoy Dubliners because it's one that I can actually read and understand. As you get further into his catalog and you get to books like Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, these books are big, dense, and extraordinarily difficult to understand because James Joyce is doing some of the same things that Virginia Woolf is doing, like Marcel Proust had done, where he's exploring consciousness and what people are actually thinking. And then add on top of that, James Joyce is developing his own vocabulary that's built upon Irish slang. So he's got these long, vivid descriptions of what's going on in people's mind. And it's not even in, well, what I would call normal English. It's like Irish slang on steroids, which sounds beautiful. And I mean, who isn't enamored with Irish slang? But it makes for very difficult reading. Most people consider James Joyce's masterwork to be this particular book, Ulysses, which is, superficially, a retelling of Homer's The Odyssey. So just a quick revisit of ancient Greek literature. Homer wrote two major works. The first was the Iliad, which was about the epic battle of Troy. And then his second work, The Odyssey, is an epic-long poem about how the character of Odysseus tries to get back home from Troy, and it takes him 20 years to make his way back home, and about all the adventures and the struggles that he has along the way. Okay, so Ulysses is about two men, Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom, and how they are trying to make their way back home over the course of 24 hours through the streets of Dublin. The date of this epic event is June the 16th, 1904. And because James Joyce chose this as his particular date, June the 16th is actually celebrated in Ireland and in some places, particularly Irish bars in the United States of America. People call this Bloomsday after the character of Leopold Bloom in the novel. And usually on Bloomsday celebration, people read passages out of Ulysses. Now, I have not read the work of Ulysses. I likely never will. I have read passages of it. It's extraordinarily complicated. It's monumentally thick too. It's, 500 pages, 600 pages. It's a major work, and it is not easy reading. And let me give you an example of this. So this is one of the most famous passages from James Joyce Ulysses. It's always the one that I hear about whenever I read about James Joyce's Ulysses. And so near the end of the novel, Leopold Bloom's wife, Molly, who's been waiting for him for 24 hours, has this rapturous moment while she is thinking about her husband. And this is what's typically referred to as Molly Bloom's soliloquy. And you see at this passage, if you just look at it physically, there's no punctuation. It's one massive run-on sentence. But what James Joyce is trying to do is capture the thoughts of Molly Bloom as they flow through her mind, and one can argue as they flow through her whole body as she thinks about her husband. And again, I've never actually read the entirety of Ulysses, just these like small passages as examples of Ulysses. But from my understanding, what Molly Bloom is experiencing is awakening to the sensual world, which for her is a far more meaningful world. So this passage, and this is probably why this passage is so popular, it's very romantic, it's very erotic. This run-on sentence is Joyce trying to capture accurately Molly Bloom's experience of romantic love. And so I am not going to read this particular passage, but if you'd like, feel free to pause the lecture and read it for yourself. One thing that you'll see is that throughout this run-on sentence, James Joyce places the word yes. So she's just thinking these thoughts to herself, and then all of a sudden there's a yes, and then there's another yes, and then there's another yes, 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 which sort of builds up to this final climactic yes, which obviously has some significant romantic connotations. So there's Molly Bloom's soliloquy. There's James Joyce Ulysses. I guess one thing I'll say about the book Ulysses, and this should be quite memorable, it was the first published book in the English language to contain the F word. Probably because of that and some of its content, this book was banned in some areas. I know it was controversial here in the United States of America. But hey, I guess a good example of modernism, right? Using that foul word that would never be used in the past, now using it openly in a published work. Well, that's a rejection of tradition. There's an example of the lure of heresy. The F-bomb making an appearance in James Joyce Ulysses. All right, so I mentioned how James Joyce left Ireland and spent most of his life in Paris, France. So I thought I would at least mention this iconic bookstore in Paris, France, which contains a lot of books in English. And you can tell that from the title of this store, or the name of the store rather, that's in Paris. It is the Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris, France. And especially in the 1920s, there were a great deal of writers from the English-speaking world, the British Isles, and the United States that came to live in Paris, France. And here was this iconic location where many of them would spend time and hang out. And so it's obviously still around today. This is a modern picture of it. It's just this cool, iconic little place in Paris, France, and in particular the Latin Quarter. If you go into it, it's a bookstore, the likes of which you tend not to see today. I mean, bookstores are sort of going extinct as a whole today, sadly. But this is very much an old-fashioned one with the old-fashioned bookshelves, the books piled up high to the ceiling. And back in the 1920s, you could find James Joyce hanging out there. Other great American writers that hung out in Paris in the 1920s, the Fitzgeralds, both F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, a lot of those roaring 20s writers. Many of them were in the 1920s, many of them became expatriates going over to Paris, France to live and to write in Paris. Yes, so this is an image of James Joyce in Shakespeare and Company bookstore back in the 1920s. You see those promotional posters for the scandalous Ulysses, which had recently been published. And you'll notice that James Joyce is wearing an eye patch. So my understanding is that James Joyce had an eyeball that would sometimes be swollen, which would create distorted vision. So he would wear this eye patch to have monocular vision, and so he could see better. All right, so there's James Joyce, one of the great modernist writers, and we move on. And so in this lecture on modernism, I've taken it into the 20th century. Now I would like to stop, back up, go back to the late 19th century, and we're leaving the world of literature, or at least the world of fictional literature, and we're going to go into the world of philosophy and psychology. Yeah, psychology. That's a new field of study in the late 19th century. All right, so as you can tell from this image, if you're looking at it, the one big philosopher that I'm going to talk about from the late 19th century is the German turned Swiss philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And then as we introduce this new field of study called psychology, we're going to learn about the man who's considered to be the first modern psychologist, Sigmund Freud. Likely you've heard of Freud. You may have heard of Friedrich Nietzsche too. And as I am trying to diagram here in this particular slide, both of them drew inspiration from Charles Darwin. Not really directly. Neither Nietzsche nor Freud wrote in their works directly about how Charles Darwin's theory of evolution influenced their perspectives directly. However, there is a lot of Darwinism inherent in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche and the psychology of Sigmund Freud. Specifically this. So to help make sense out of this slide, here's what I want you to know. Charles Darwin explained to us how we human beings are not separate from the animal kingdom. We are part of the animal kingdom. That's the big fundamental idea that underlies both the philosophy of Nietzsche and the psychology of Freud. We human beings are animals, and we have the same animalistic impulses that any animal on the planet has. We're subject to the same forces of evolution. We are not separate. We are not somehow closer to God. We are an animal, and that is an important idea. Remember that. Kind of Charles Darwin establishes this, and so it undergirds a lot of the artistic and intellectual movements that come along in the late 19th and 20th century after him. Okay, so especially when we talk about Freud and we talk about Nietzsche, this idea that we are animals and that we're in a struggle for survival, that self-concept will emerge pretty clearly in the ideas of both of these men. Okay, so Nietzsche and Freud, let's talk about them. Let's start off with Friedrich Nietzsche. He was born in Germany in 1844, specifically Prussia in 1844. He was extraordinarily intelligent, so smart in fact that he didn't even complete his undergraduate studies in college when he was hired by the University of Basel in Switzerland to come and be a full professor. So that's pretty impressive. You don't even get your undergraduate degree yet, and you're already hired to do the work of a full doctor, somebody with a doctorate degree. The professors at the University of Basel in Switzerland had read his work and were so impressed with his mind that they literally just hired him. So he moved to Basel, Switzerland, where he fell in love with the mountains of Switzerland. He was a professor of philology at the University of Basel. Philology is the history or the development of languages. And he was teaching at the University of Basel when he published his first major work, which was called The Birth of Tragedy. And The Birth of Tragedy was such a radical book that he lost his job at the University of Basel. He was too far out there for people at the University of Basel. And so from there on out, Nietzsche was pretty much a recluse, living by himself in the mountains of Switzerland, and a writer until the year 1900, where he died at a fairly young age. Throughout the last decade or more of his life, I'm not exactly sure how long, he was severely mentally impaired. People would have said back then he's just gone crazy, and likely that mental impairment was the result of contracting syphilis from a prostitute. Nietzsche lived a very lonely life. He fell in love with one of his close friend's wife, and that didn't go over very well. We'll talk about that individual later because he's another famous person from this era in history. But Nietzsche never found the love that he and most people in life want. So Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher who moved to the Swiss Alps, and there's the Swiss Alps. Ah, the Swiss Alps. How beautiful is that? I maybe wouldn't mind being a recluse in the Swiss Alps, except I like my family and friends too much. All right, but there they are. Very influential to Friedrich Nietzsche, who went on daily excursions walking through the mountains of Switzerland, where he proclaimed, "It is only through walking that I have my grandest ideas." And really, this image of somebody climbing a mountain is sort of a great metaphor for understanding the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophy is very difficult to summarize. In fact, it's impossible to summarize. And what I'm going to give you here in this particular lecture is really only one particular lens by which you can understand Nietzsche. Nietzsche did not write like a typical philosopher. He wrote literature. Probably his most famous fictional work is something called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But even that work is written in a very non-traditional manner. Nietzsche wrote these short sentences, these aphorisms, these sort of quick phrases. And so today, and I'm going to introduce a couple of these phrases, these aphorisms here in a moment. So today, this makes Nietzsche very quotable, the fact that he didn't write these long passages, but he wrote these quick statements. But the thing is, the statements would many times contradict each other, which makes Nietzsche really hard to understand. Nietzsche is more of a poet than he is a traditional philosopher. People who enjoy Nietzsche, they like this element of Nietzsche because you read Nietzsche and it's a different experience than reading, I think, any other philosopher, because Nietzsche sort of pumps you up because he does write like a poet. It's very powerful stuff, what he writes. It's what makes Nietzsche today, I think, still one of the most popular philosophers for many people to read. I mean, it's a lot easier to read Friedrich Nietzsche than, say, I don't know, John Locke or Hegel or somebody like that. Okay, so again, Nietzsche is a very difficult philosopher to explain or to describe, but here is how I would like to approach Nietzsche. Again, this is just one lens into Nietzsche. This is only one perspective into Nietzsche's philosophy, but it's one that I feel is a perspective that Nietzsche himself, insofar as I can guess, he would be okay with. Okay, let's start with the idea of struggle. I want to begin this foray into understanding the philosophy of Nietzsche by beginning with the feeling of struggle, because I think that will unlock a lot of Nietzsche's philosophy in a comprehensible way. All right, so struggle. In life, we go through struggles. Everybody does to varying degrees. We all face difficult situations. Now, for most of us, our inclination is to avoid those difficult situations. I mean, I would rather have a pleasant day where everybody was nice to me than have an unpleasant day where people are mean to me, I lose my job, my wife leaves me for another man. I mean, those things I would not want to deal with. That sounds very difficult. That would be a horrible struggle if I had a day like that. I'd much rather just have a day where, I show up to work, people are nice to me, I go home, my wife gives me a peck on the cheek and says, "I love you, honey." And my son gives me a hug and tells me how much he loves me. That sounds like a nice day. I don't want to deal with going to work and finding out that I've been fired, my wife's leaving me for another guy. Like, that sounds horrible. But we're going to face tough times. It's inevitable. We're going to face struggle. We're going to experience pain. Most people, even though they say they don't want that, well, let me phrase it like this. Most people say they don't want that. But, and here's where we introduce the philosophy of Nietzsche. Nietzsche insists that it's that struggle, it's that dealing with difficulty and overcoming the difficulty that allows you to have the opportunity to grow and to become a stronger and better person. So here's where Nietzsche starts to get weird. Pain and suffering and struggle is good for you. And it's not only good for you, you should seek it out. Be willing to face the dragons in life, to conquer obstacles, to throw yourself into hardship, and then when you overcome it, you feel exaltation. Okay, so hopefully, so now think back upon why I said, the philosophy of Nietzsche is sort of good for a mountain climber. I mean, who's going to willingly go out and climb a mountain? But somebody who's like, yeah, I want the challenge. I'm willing to face death. I'm willing to face falling into a 10,000-foot crevice and dying. I'm willing to face cold weather. I'm willing to face all this stuff so I can summit that mountain and I can look down upon humanity and I can feel superior because I'm stronger. Okay, that's Nietzsche. All right, so let's put a few terms here with Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche says that most people want to avoid hardships. They want to live a nice, quiet life. I probably personally am one of these people. Friedrich Nietzsche refers to those people as slaves. But, he said, there are those that when they are challenged, it inspires something in them. This life force, this desire to survive. And so it starts to sound a little Darwinian. It starts to sound like something out of Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection, that there's this desire to fight, there's this desire to survive. And in the second half of his professional life, Nietzsche developed this idea called the will to power, or if you speak a little German, the Wille zur Macht, the will to power. And he says this will to power resides in all of us, but it doesn't come out unless we're challenged. It doesn't come out until you face difficulty. And then when you face difficulty, you find out what you're made of. Do you crumble? Do you submit? Do you become sheepish? Or do you fight back? And Nietzsche says that you all have within you this desire to fight. It's this life force that's within you. And he calls this the will to power. Of course, the only time the will to power has an opportunity to exert itself is during times of difficulty. So, Nietzsche encourages you to seek out the struggle, to face difficulties, to put yourself in a position where you're vulnerable, where you're weak, and then fight. Because when you do that, that toughens you up so that you become a better, stronger person. And you feel this emotional exaltation. All right, so will to power is one term that we can associate with Friedrich Nietzsche. The life force within you that impels you to struggle, and it gets you to fight, and it helps you become your greatest self. All right, so now I'm going to give you another term that Nietzsche introduced. And this term refers to a man. And it's clear Nietzsche said this has to be a man. Nietzsche is very misogynistic in his philosophy in that he does not believe that women have the constitution to handle the type of struggle to achieve greatness. There's something very macho and masculine about Nietzsche's philosophy. In other words, men, not women, are able to embrace this will to power. All right, and among men, Nietzsche talks about there being one man who is so constitutionally strong, who embraces the will to power so much that he becomes the superior man. Nothing can hurt him. He can face any tribulation, any hardship, and love the experience. So Nietzsche talked about this as one individual, one man. I don't know in his philosophy, because his philosophy is so complicated, if he actually thought this was to be one man, like a savior of some sort, or if it could be multiple men who could achieve this. But he wrote about it as if it was one man. And this term, this man, he gives a term to. And I'll give you the German version first. The German name that Nietzsche, of course, wrote was Übermensch. So Über is the German word for over. Mensch is the German word for man or mankind. And so it's sometimes translated as the overman, but other, especially late 20th century translations of Nietzsche, interpreted this word as Superman. And it is my understanding that the Superman cartoon, or whoever created the Superman cartoon figure, took the name from Nietzsche. Now, that's what I understand. You can check me on that. But the Übermensch, the overman, the Superman, this was Nietzsche's ideal human being. Somebody who can face any challenge, any difficulty. And from my perspective, also an individual that, although Nietzsche would never describe him like this, fairly lonely, or at least separated from the rest of humanity because he doesn't need the rest of humanity. Okay, so the Übermensch. All right, so I also mentioned that I would give you some of Nietzsche's aphorisms. And here is probably the most famous one. This phrase, this aphorism, which has become so popular that I would say it has detached itself from the original source, which was Friedrich Nietzsche. I think it's also the best phrase to memorize in association with Nietzsche's philosophy to best encapsulate Nietzsche's philosophy, which is really hard to encapsulate. So here it is. That which does not kill you makes you stronger. And given everything I've described about Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy up to this point, hopefully that sentence doesn't need much explanation. That which does not kill you makes you stronger. Might be worth it here just to pause the lecture and think about this. Do you agree with this? To what extent do you agree with this? For me personally, I think about war veterans, people, men and women, soldiers and civilians that have seen the horrors of battle and then are lucky enough to make it home and the war's over. Would they say that experience, which did not kill them, actually made them stronger? And I don't know. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But for Nietzsche, who never fought as a soldier, he says, universally, that which does not kill you makes you stronger. All right. Exploring Nietzsche's philosophy a little bit more. According to Friedrich Nietzsche, he wrote a lot about how in Europe there were two vices. A vice is an immoral behavior. It is something you shouldn't do. It's something that is bad for you and should be avoided. So now, take everything you've learned about Nietzsche so far, that life is a struggle. Struggle is something that should be embraced. Struggle is something that you should love because it unleashes your will to power and it helps you to rise above most of humanity that doesn't want to struggle, and you turn into a superior individual, maybe even an Übermensch. What do you think he would say is a wicked or immoral behavior? According to Nietzsche, there are two European vices, and they were religion, specifically Christianity, and alcohol. Christianity and alcohol are both very bad for you, according to Friedrich Nietzsche. Let's start with Christianity first. Nietzsche argued that Christianity makes you weak, that when you face the struggles in life, then as a Christian, or at least as Nietzsche understood Christianity, you are not to try to conquer the struggle, but rather accept this is the way life is. You are to be, like Jesus, a sheep. And as a Christian, you accept that this is the world is full of sin, but because you are a Christian and because you believe that Jesus died for your sins, then you get to live in heaven afterwards. And Nietzsche thought this is very bad for you. It's a very bad mindset to say when bad things happen. So for example, if somebody's being mean to you, as a Christian, you're taught, turn the other cheek. Allow the bad thing to happen to you. Be submissive. So let me go back to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus said, and I'm going to use sort of my own words here, when Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount that if somebody comes up to you and demands that you give him your coat, then, so says Jesus, give him your coat and give him your shirt too. Give him more than what he asked for, this mean bully of a person. And then rest secure in the knowledge that you are a good person, that you are going to go to heaven when you die. Nietzsche would openly say, no, if there's a bully who comes up to you and says, give me your coat, you shouldn't give him your coat. You should punch him in the nose. You should fight. So according to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's interpretation of Christianity, Christianity makes you a weak, submissive, sheepish person. Somebody who's not willing to embrace the will to power and to fight and to rise up and to be great. He said that Christianity inspires meekness. Just like Jesus said, blessed are the meek. Nietzsche says, no, don't be meek, be aggressive. Strive to be the Übermensch. All right, I'll come back and talk a little bit about Nietzsche and his perspective on Christianity here in a second. All right, now let's talk about alcohol. So first, a little biography here of Nietzsche. Nietzsche got drunk, so far as we know, once in his life. He was in a fraternity in college, and coincidentally, there's a photograph, which I did not include in this slideshow, of Nietzsche with his fraternity leaning against a huge beer keg. Or it's not particularly huge, it's just a beer keg, a big barrel of beer, which is kind of ironic given Nietzsche's stance on alcohol. So Nietzsche got really drunk with his fraternity brothers as a college kid, no surprise there. It seems to be sort of the standard fraternity experience in college, even back in the 19th century. And he had that one experience and he did not enjoy it. And he actually wrote a letter home to his mom describing the experience, which is why we know about this later on in history. Historians have read this letter. And he talks about how embarrassed he was, how silly he behaved, and he avowed that he would never get drunk again. And, at least so far as the historical record shows, he never did. So what's Nietzsche's personal beef with alcohol? Well, he sees alcohol as the same as Christianity. It's something that people indulge in to numb their pain. So it's Friday evening, you've had a long week of work, you're tired, you're stressed out, you go to the bar, you have a beer, and then one beer turns into several beers, and you're drunk and life is pleasant. But life isn't really pleasant. You've just put yourself into this drunken state of bliss, and you're a stupid, foolish idiot. And from Nietzsche's perspective, you have removed yourself from the pain and therefore from your ability to embrace the struggle and the will to power. So alcohol and Christianity, according to Nietzsche, both bad for you because they numb the pain, and you shouldn't numb your pain. You should embrace your pain and fight. All right. Another quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. It's hard to say that he was an atheist because there's sort of this vibrant spirituality in Nietzsche that you have within you, this pulse of life that he calls the will to power. But many atheists embraced Friedrich Nietzsche because of his proclamation, which you see here, God is dead. Another very simple, very short sentence to memorize and to use if ever you have to write about Friedrich Nietzsche. The first sentence to memorize, that which does not kill you makes you stronger. And then the second statement, very short and sweet, God is dead. And there are various interpretations about what Nietzsche means when he makes this proclamation. But I think it's fair to say that how Nietzsche intends this short sentence to be used is like this: to become a better, stronger human being, to embrace your will to power, and to strive to be an Übermensch, you don't worship God. You do not submit yourself to a God, but rather you live as if you are yourself a God. You become all-powerful. That's what you should strive for. So I'm no expert on Nietzsche, but I hope that's a fair explanation for his very short sentence here. God is dead. Okay, just to revisit the anti-Christian element of Nietzsche, I always like bringing this up, and I'm venturing outside the bounds of European history here and coming to American history, but I love this. I find this very meaningful. On the screen here is an individual who read Friedrich Nietzsche when he was in college and was very challenged by Nietzsche's philosophy and in a certain way inspired by Nietzsche's philosophy. A young Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in seminary school, he read Friedrich Nietzsche. And so Martin Luther King Jr., studying to become a minister, a Christian minister, reads Nietzsche and really takes to heart Nietzsche's words. And the young MLK wondered, by embracing Christianity, by being a Christian minister, by trying to live a life of a good Christian, am I becoming meek and sheepish? And then, of course, this is Martin Luther King Jr. we're talking about here. And even though he's at the sort of the dawn of his adulthood, he is still interested in civil rights, and he believed that African Americans should fight for equality in the United States. And so the other thing that Martin Luther King Jr. studied when he was in seminary school was the slave rebellions of the early 19th century in the United States of America, and in particular, the slave rebellion of a slave named Nat Turner. And Nat Turner organized an incredible slave rebellion that happened throughout the South, and these slaves rose up in violent rebellion to kill white people and to free themselves. And King said, well, he didn't say it, he just acknowledged that this didn't work. And so Martin Luther King Jr. worked to develop his own particular philosophy and really this own specific Christian theology that rejects the violence of Nat Turner because that didn't work, but also avoids the Nietzschean criticism of Christianity that Christians should just turn the other cheek and be weak and submissive. And so King developed this philosophy that he called Soul Force that turns the central element of Christianity of loving your neighbor and forgiving your enemies as a method to fight. And out of this came King's nonviolent non-cooperation, his peaceful protesting, which I think most people can argue King implemented with some success from the 1950s through the 1960s. And it inspired a whole generation of protests in the 1960s. So, okay, sorry about that. A little bit of a side anecdote there from Nietzsche, but I've always been fascinated with how Nietzsche actually inspired Martin Luther King Jr. Nietzsche, who's like the icon of anti-Christianity, and King, who took his interpretation of Christianity and developed a new way to fight. All right, so back to Nietzsche and to European history. So let me give you at least one piece of literature from Friedrich Nietzsche. He wrote a lot. I like talking about this one because for me, this is for me personally, I think the most coherent, and it was his first major work. It was called The Birth of Tragedy, and that's how most publications today just simply print it, The Birth of Tragedy. The full title was, and I like the full title, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. Okay, so in this, Nietzsche explores why the Greeks developed tragedy. And no surprise here, the Greeks developed the theater of tragedy, and the Greeks loved tragedy, and we still love tragedy today because that pain, that suffering, it inspires something in us. There's something in us that loves tragedy. So sad movies, sad songs, there's something in those things that stir us up and encourage us to embrace the will to power. The ancient Greeks. Here's a modern image of the most iconic of all of the architectural structures that were built in Athens by the ancient Greeks. Here's the Parthenon. In the 19th century, most people interpreted the Parthenon as a product of Greek rationalism. You need science, you need technology, you need advanced mathematics to build this beautiful structure. And that's all true. But Nietzsche reminds us that this magnificent piece of architecture was constructed immediately following a devastating war that the Athenians had with the Persians. And Nietzsche argued that it was that pain, it was that suffering that the Greeks had endured that inspired them to build this magnificent structure on the ruins of that pain and suffering. The Parthenon is a testimony to the will to power. Nietzsche was himself a little bit of a loner. He did spend a little bit of time gardening. Not that those two things are necessarily related, but he did spend time alone and he did spend time in his garden gardening. And he, in some of his writings, talked about how enduring pain and suffering is a little bit like a plant being pruned. Yes, it's painful. There's suffering involved. But when a plant is pruned and it lets go of one little branch, well, then the rest of it grows fuller and stronger. So when you're going through hardships, you can think of yourself as like a plant being pruned. Nietzsche has gotten a bad rap over the course of the 20th century because he's been associated with Nazism. So how did this happen? Well, part of this association comes from the fact that Nietzsche wrote about a great conquering people called the Aryans. Now, historically, the Aryans were a group of people who invaded northern India several thousand years ago and created the caste system in northern India. Now, Nietzsche wasn't the only writer in the late 19th century to write about the Aryan people and to refer to these Aryan people as a master race. But when we get to the middle of the 20th century and we have the development of Nazism, which we'll learn about later on, this word Aryan is co-opted by the Nazis to refer to pure-blooded Germans and them being the master race. So Nietzsche used the word Aryan, the Nazis used the word Aryan. So when we go back and read Nietzsche and we read about this Aryan race of people, you sometimes get the feel that Nietzsche was a little bit of a proto-Nazi. Now this is probably unfair to Friedrich Nietzsche because obviously Nazism isn't around yet, and one of the chief elements of Nazism is anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jews. So what did Friedrich Nietzsche think about Jewish people? Well, this is a question that I am personally not comfortable answering because I am not a Nietzsche scholar. In some of his books, Nietzsche wrote some things about the Jewish people that I would say personally sound somewhat disparaging. But, on the other hand, he spent far more time ridiculing Christians than he ever did Jews. In his personal life, Nietzsche broke off a friendship with a person that we'll meet here in a second because he was anti-Semitic, and Nietzsche disagreed with that extreme anti-Semitism. So it doesn't really seem like Nietzsche is that much of a proto-Nazi. But at the end of his life, his sister, Elizabeth, was taking care of him. And if you remember, at the end of his life, he didn't really have full mental capacity. He was mentally unsound. And his sister, Elizabeth, was an anti-Semite. Then Nietzsche dies in the year 1900. Elizabeth goes on to live to meet Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. And she, a fan of both Adolf Hitler and her brother's philosophy, advocated that Nietzsche's works were consistent with Nazism. So Nietzsche is associated with Nazism because of his language, his use of the word Aryan, and also because of essentially the PR job that his sister did, promoting his works as being pro-Nazi. So let me talk about this famous friend that I've been alluding to several times. So Friedrich Nietzsche was friends with the German composer Richard Wagner. So yes, there he is on the screen. There's his name. We Americans would probably look at that and call him Richard Wagner, but he's German, so it's pronounced Richard Wagner. And Wagner was known for his epic operas. Nietzsche really looked up to Wagner, really wanted to be like Wagner. Nietzsche tried his hand at composing piano sonatas, none of which were really good. And according to Wagner, were just these over-the-top, very dramatic pieces, which seems to be no surprise given Nietzsche's philosophy. It seems likely that his piano sonatas would be like bang, 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 very dramatic. But they lacked subtlety, they weren't very good, and Nietzsche also dreamed of writing an opera. He did not have the musical talent to do that. And Richard Wagner, a very happily married man, a major celebrity in Europe with his operas. Nietzsche looked up to him. He also was probably in love with Richard Wagner's wife, but Nietzsche separated from him when Richard Wagner started expressing some really anti-Semitic ideas. Richard Wagner was very much a product of early 19th century German nationalism. And you might remember that in the early 19th century, during the time of the development of the Burschenschaften and Friedrich Jahn, the father of gymnastics, there was this idea that to be German was to be a pure-blooded German, and that Jews were not part of these pure-blooded Germans. And Richard Wagner very much developed that sense of being a pure German and having this great German heritage. So now, to split away from Nietzsche and to talk about Richard Wagner is a great example of German nationalism, a very famous composer of the Romantic style tradition. So even though he's late 19th century, he was very inspired by Beethoven and is himself considered to be a Romantic. And he's also this German nationalist. So he took old stories from German folklore, and in particular an epic German story from the Middle Ages called the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelungens, and he created these epic operas. There were 4 operas in all, and they lined up. It's sort of like a part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. And they involve all these German figures from German mythology, gods like Thor and Woden, and the other Germanic gods. You've likely heard one part of his opera, a song called The Flight of the Valkyries. And if you look this up on YouTube or something, you listen to it, you listen to the first few seconds of it, and you're like, oh yeah, I've heard that before. The Valkyries were these female goddesses that would fly over a battlefield, and they would choose to go to the heaven in German mythology is Valhalla. The Valkyries would choose those that had died valiantly in battle to go to Valhalla. You couldn't just die in battle and go to Valhalla. You had to die valiantly. So the flight of the Valkyries swooping down over the battlefield. And speaking of these Valkyries, there's also a phrase that you have likely heard that also relates to this long cycle of operas that Richard Wagner wrote. So at the very end of these 4 operas, finally, hours and hours long, it all ends when one of the Valkyries, one of these women who, if you look at your screen right now, there's one of the women who played one of the Valkyries who was given the final song. This Valkyrie goes out onto the stage and she sings her final song, thus ending the entire opera cycle. And so the phrase that came out of this was, "It ain't over until the fat lady sings." If you ever heard that phrase is a reference to Wagner's opera series, which is The Ring of the Nibelung. All right, Richard Wagner there. All right, I think I'm done with Nietzsche. So back to this particular slide that we see right here. So Charles Darwin inspired indirectly the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, because after Darwin, people are starting to think about human beings as animals who are in the struggle for survival. And that's what Nietzsche does. Nietzsche takes away human beings being this exclusively rational creature. We're not rational, according to Friedrich Nietzsche. We're emotional. We've got this drive, we've got this instinct, this will to power. We want to conquer. So one way of looking at Friedrich Nietzsche in the history of philosophy is he breaks from rationalism, which is why for a lot of people today, his philosophy is fun to read because it's very energetic and it's very poetic and it's not just, the rational development of ideas, which you get with pretty much every other philosopher. All right, and then the other great thinker of the late 19th and really early 20th century also looked at human beings as fundamentally irrational creatures. And that individual is Sigmund Freud, who is the father of modern psychology. All right, so let's learn about what this means. First of all, this term psychology. What is psychology? Psychology can be defined as the scientific study of human thought, feeling, and behavior. So let's unpack that a little bit. The scientific study of human thought, feeling, and behavior. All right, the stuff we think, the things we feel, and how we act, thought, feeling, and behavior. Now, let it be said that you and every other human being on this earth is an amateur psychologist, because you think about these 3 things probably quite frequently throughout the day. For example, let's say you're walking down the hallway of Upper Arlington High School, you see your friend, you say, "Hey friend," and you wave at your friend, and your friend snubs you. Your friend looks at you, then looks the other way and walks right by you without saying hello. And you think to yourself, what the heck was that? I just got snubbed. And you might feel confused, you might feel angry, I don't know how you're going to feel in that situation. But you're probably going to ask yourself the following questions. What is my friend thinking? What is my friend feeling? I know the way my friend behaved. They blew me off. So you start wondering, did I do something? Did I say something? Are they upset with me? Or were they just distracted with their own thoughts? You're trying to figure out your friend's thoughts and feelings and behaviors, assuming that the way your friend thinks and the way your friend feels and the way your friend behaves are all tied together. So we're all amateur psychologists. We think about this stuff all the time. Now, what the field of psychology endeavors to do is in the first line of this definition. The field of psychology endeavors to make a scientific study of human thought, feeling, and behavior. So psychologists want to apply the scientific method to the study of human thought, feeling, and behavior. So in the in the late 19th century, when Freud was around, most of that scientific study was really just observation and making observation over with groups of human beings, or more likely, specifically in the case of Freud, with individuals, making observation of individuals who were seeking psychotherapy or psychological help And from making those observations on human beings, coming up with a theory to describe all human beings. So that was psychology in the 19th century. Obviously, a lot has happened since the late 19th century, early 20th century, and psychology today is a far more rigorous field of study where you have the actual implementation of the scientific method, where they do controlled studies that are double-blind studies with control groups so that we can identify patterns in human behavior. Also, the field of psychology is pretty exciting today because we've got technology that we've been developing since the second half of the 20th century where we can actually see inside, well, let me phrase this more correctly here. We can monitor what brains are doing. So as we try to understand human thought, feeling, and behavior, if somebody is feeling a particular way, like let's say they're feeling very happy, well, we can use technology today like EEG, MRI, fMRI, to identify precisely what the brain is doing when it is feeling happy or depressed or angry or jealous or whatever feeling. We can see what brains are doing when they're awake, when they're asleep, when they're dreaming, and so on. But this is psychology. It's the scientific study of human thought, feeling, and behavior. Now, obviously, psychology, the study of these things, it's been around since forever. It's hard to imagine human beings being human beings and not being, to some extent, psychologists trying to figure these things out. But psychology just simply came out of other traditions. It came out of mostly philosophy. Human thought, feeling, and behavior prior to the late 19th century was mostly under the domain of philosophy, but also theology, also biology. But in the late 19th century, psychology emerges as its own field of study. So we get to talk about psychology now. All right, and Sigmund Freud is considered to be the first modern psychologist. Okay, so who was Sigmund Freud? So Freud was born in 1856 in the Austrian Empire, although the city that he was born in is today part of the Czech Republic. He grew up the eldest son of a Jewish family. He was a little bit of a brat as a kid. He had several siblings, but he insisted that he have his own room because he was the oldest boy, and he got his own room while his siblings all slept together in a crowded room. But he was extraordinarily smart. So really sort of similar to Nietzsche, really demonstrated a high scholastic aptitude at a young age. The way the Austrian educational system worked back then was different from how our current American educational system worked. Back then, you did not apply to colleges. The colleges would go to the schools and pick the top students. And it would usually be the high school teachers or the gymnasium teachers who would select the top students who they believed would be able to handle college or university. And Freud was selected to be the top of his class. So he went on to medical school in Vienna, became a medical doctor, but could not get a job because Freud was Jewish. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism that was developing at the time, especially in Austria, especially in Vienna in the late 19th century. And so Freud gets, well, an interesting job. He does find a job as a physician, but it wasn't necessarily a traditional physician's job. So let's learn about what he did. So Freud got a job with this guy. His name was Joseph Breuer, or in German, Josef Breuer. I'm going to stick with calling him Breuer. So Breuer worked with patients, mostly women, who were experiencing something called hysteria. These women reported bizarre experiences, bizarre emotional states. They were behaving in rather erratic ways, and I'll give you an example of this. But there was nothing that they could identify, that Breuer could identify, that was physically wrong with them. So Joseph Breuer, his most famous patient, was an individual who he identified as Anna O. He gave her a pseudonym, which was Anna O, a fake name for the medical journals, because both he and Sigmund Freud wrote quite a bit about her. We now know her real name was Bertha Pappenheim. And Anna O was a very interesting case study. She was an Austrian woman whose native language was German, but when she grew very nervous, she forgot German, but she was fluent in French and English, languages that she had learned in school. But she forgot her native tongue of German. She had wild hallucinations. She saw herself being attacked by snakes and skeletons that were not there. Sometimes she would hear music and lose control of her arms. She experienced like this temporary paralysis. So she had all of these bizarre conditions, but physically, nothing seemed to be wrong with her. Most doctors said, this woman is making it up. She's hysterical, these are problems that are in her own head, and there is nothing we can do about it. But Breuer was far more sympathetic to Anna O, and he wanted to try to help her. He wanted to believe that Anna O was not choosing to sort of make these things up, to somehow force herself to forget German or pretend that her arms were paralyzed or something like that. She wasn't making it up, but rather she was experiencing something that was beyond her control. So Breuer, in attempting to help Anna O, utilized a very controversial practice, and it's still sort of controversial today. He hypnotized her. So hypnosis has a long history. There's a lot to hypnosis that I'm not going to get into this lecture, but there's plenty out there on the internet about hypnosis if you're interested in learning more about it. But psychologists today, and back then, identified hypnosis as an altered state of consciousness somewhere in between being awake and being asleep and dreaming. And under a state of hypnosis, you, the hypnotized, are very much under the influence and the suggestions of the hypnotizer. So for example, if you're hypnotized today and the person who's hypnotized you says, okay, now jump on the table and start acting like you're a chicken, you are likely going to behave in this way. So sometimes today people resort to hypnosis to quit smoking, for example, because the power of the hypnotizer is so powerful. Controversially, in the 18th century, there was a man by the name of Anton Mesmer who did these hypnotizing shows. And he said that he had special powers, which was false, but it made for a great show, and he would hypnotize people and get them to do stuff. I always like bringing up Anton Mesmer as one of the individuals who helped to develop hypnosis because we get our word mesmerize from Anton Mesmer. Okay, so Joseph Breuer took hypnosis and he applied it to Anna O. So Breuer hypnotized Anna O. And when he hypnotized her, he asked for her to talk about her childhood and what she had experienced growing up. And while under hypnosis, Anna O began talking vividly about what she remembered from when she was a young girl. And she talked about several traumatic experiences that she had that she couldn't recall when she was not under hypnosis, or at least not before the first hypnosis therapy sessions. Beforehand, she couldn't recall these experiences of trauma, but while under hypnosis, she could recall the experiences of trauma. And then after the hypnosis therapy was over, and Breuer awakens her from the hypnotic state, he goes over this experience once again with her while she is fully conscious. And what he found was these bizarre symptoms that she had were alleviated. So, somehow, this individual, Anna O, who suffered from what they called back then hysteria, by being hypnotized, revisiting the traumatic experiences of her early childhood, recalling them, talking about them, sort of getting it out, helped alleviate these symptoms of hysteria that she had that were somehow associated with her early childhood. And Breuer helped Anna O. Okay, so it's an interesting story. And so Freud was working with Breuer. Freud's just a young guy out of college, or a young guy who just received his medical degree. Sigmund Freud never actually met Anna O, but Anna O is the one who inspired Sigmund Freud to come up with a whole philosophy of human psychology and how our minds work. Okay, so before I go on here, I feel compelled to talk a little bit more about hypnosis because I don't want you to walk away from this lecture thinking, oh wow, I've got all these repressed memories from my early childhood and I can get hypnotized and it can all come out. And I don't know if I'm experiencing any type of anxiety that, oh, this can be a way to relieve it. Understand that hypnosis is very controversial even still today. And what we found is that we can't really substantiate what people say happened to them in their early childhood under hypnosis actually happened to them, because when you are under hypnosis, you really are vulnerable to the suggestions of the person who hypnotized you. So for example, if you get hypnotized and the hypnotizer said or asks you, do you remember any traumatic experiences from when you were 5? You might be compelled to start making up a memory. And so that's why hypnosis is highly controversial as a form of psychotherapy. All right. But hey, that's all I'm going to say about hypnosis. Again, there's a lot of great stuff out there on hypnosis. You can learn more about it on your own. Let's return back to Sigmund Freud and what makes Sigmund Freud the father of modern psychology. Okay. So Freud was really interested in the fact that Anna O had these repressed memories that she didn't, well, what made them repressed is they were memories that she couldn't remember. But they were, even though she couldn't consciously remember the trauma of her early childhood, they were somehow influencing her perception of things, her behavior, the way even her body worked. So Anna O, before her symptoms were alleviated, was clearly having her thoughts, her feelings, and her behaviors driven by an unconscious force. This is what makes Sigmund Freud the father of modern psychology. He constructs a whole psychological theory based around this fundamental idea, the unconscious. What is the unconscious? Okay, so here's one of those times where I'm going to give you an informal definition of something. This is my definition of the unconscious, but I believe it works, and most definitions of the unconscious are long and complex, and I feel like I've got a nice, simple one that can help you out. Again, if you want a formal definition of the unconscious, look it up. But here's my definition of the unconscious. It's the deeper you within you. So we're talking about our concept of ourself here. So take a moment to think about yourself. Think about you, who you are. Think about your name. Think about your body. Think about what you're doing with your day today, where you've been, where you're going. Think about your life. Where do you want to go after you graduate high school, for example? What plans do you have for yourself? Think about yourself in that way. Now, that's your conscious self. So I can say, all right, I'm Joe Indris. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a teacher. And you could think of, who you are in a similar way. All those things are very, for Sigmund Freud, surface level. For Sigmund Freud, who you really are, if you really want to understand yourself, who you really are is the unconscious, the deeper you within you that motivates your behaviors and creates your thoughts and your feelings. Okay. So Sigmund Freud is similar to Friedrich Nietzsche in that he does not believe that we human beings are rational creatures. We don't think that we are a product of just logical thinking. We behave in very irrational ways. We have thoughts and feelings that do not make rational sense. And that's what he's interested in. He's interested in the unconscious. Okay, so before I go any further with Sigmund Freud, let me give you a couple of thought experiments here to have you think about your own unconscious. So if this idea is confusing to you, what do you mean the unconscious is a deeper me within me? What is this deeper me within me? Okay, well, let me give you some examples of a deeper you within you with your unconscious. Start with this. Right now, draw your attention to the position of your body. Think about where your feet are. Think about where your legs are. Think about the position of your hands, of your arms. Think about the position of your body. Now, did you make a decision to put your body in the position that it's in? No, of course not. You didn't think to yourself, okay, self, now I'm going to sit down and cross my right leg over my left leg. No, you didn't think about that. You didn't think to yourself, okay, self, now I'm going to chew my nails. No, you didn't make that decision. You're not thinking about any of that stuff. You did it all unconsciously. In much the same way that you walk down the hall. When you walk, you don't have to think, okay, now right foot, now left foot, now right foot, now left foot. No, you don't have to think about that. It happens unconsciously. But those behaviors, as kind of silly and superficial and mundane as they might be, might reflect something of your internal emotional state. So if you're nervous, you might start chewing your nails or your pencil or twirling your hair. And again, you're not making rational decisions to do these things. You're just doing them. Meaning there's a deeper you within you that's propelling you to engage in these behaviors. All right. So now let's talk about the unconscious with thoughts and feelings. Let's do thoughts first. Here's a particular exercise which you can try to do. And in all likelihood, you will fail doing it. And it seems on the outset like something that would be really easy. So if you want, try this. Set a timer for 1 minute, 60 seconds, 60 short seconds. And then decide on something to think about. Try to think of the most wonderful, the most pleasant thing that you can, something that will hold your attention for 1 minute. And then see if you can do it. See if you can hold into your mind this one pleasant thought for 60 seconds. It's your own mind, so make it whatever it is you want to make it. The most wonderful, the most pleasant thing you can imagine, and try to think of only that for 60 seconds straight. If you want to, feel free to pause the lecture and try this out. In all likelihood, you can't do it. You cannot do it because your mind will, against your will, force you to start thinking about something else. Proof that you are not in control of even your own thoughts. That this deeper you within you, the unconscious mind, is going to force you to think about things against your will. So the unconscious is controlling your behavior, the unconscious is controlling your thoughts, and the unconscious is controlling your feelings. I don't have a good thought experiment for your feelings, but just think to yourself, when was the last time you chose to be angry? Or when was the last time you chose to be happy? I think for most people, feelings aren't a choice. Now, there are particular meditative exercises to help you to develop feeling happier more and feeling more content. But I think for at least right now in our current society, most people don't think about feelings like that. Feelings are things that happen to them. They are the product of unconscious forces. So Sigmund Freud is the father of modern psychology because he places this idea, this concept of the unconscious as the foundation for all human thought, feeling, and behavior. And in so doing, he develops the particular specific branch of psychology called psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is still around today. Psychoanalysis has had its ups and downs over the course of the last, 130 years, however long it's been around. It's had its ups and downs in terms of how popular it's been within the greater field of psychology. But psychoanalysis is the branch of psychology that focuses on how the unconscious influences thought, feeling, and behavior. Okay, so Sigmund Freud, using this idea of the unconscious and the case study of Anna O is really the foundation for really his entire philosophy, his entire theory. He becomes the father of modern psychology. He developed these theories, and I'd just like to take a moment to talk about Sigmund Freud's more specific theories, in general at least. Some of Freud's specific ideas, some of his specific theories, have been repudiated by most psychologists today. So there aren't a lot of modern psychologists, and especially not a lot of modern psychotherapists, who believe in Freud's model of human thought, feeling, and behavior. However, this fundamental idea that we have an unconscious mind and that unconscious mind influences us, that certainly has not gone away. And it is still something that is very much the subject of a lot of scientific inquiry today. And especially today with our new modern technology that we can use to look at brain function and what the brain is doing, it's become interesting to look at people when they, just try to think of who try to do that thought exercise that I was talking about before and say, try to think of something pleasant. And when you do that, parts of your brain get activated, but then you can't hold on to that thought. There's other parts of your brain that are also activating. And it's interesting now we can sort of see what's going on in your brain when you're having these particular thoughts. And this might provide future insight into human thought, feeling, and behavior. Okay, so I do want to talk about how Sigmund Freud theorized, or rather, how Sigmund Freud created a theory of human personality. Again, this particular theory, it's certainly not considered to be 100% true by psychologists today, but it's worth learning about because it was so influential to the history of psychology and to the history of Western culture, especially in the early 20th century. So here is Sigmund Freud's theory of personality. So first of all, personality. It's kind of a loose term. I think it's hard for anybody to pin down exactly what personality is, but take a moment to think about yourself. Think about, are you a mostly outgoing person? Do you enjoy the company of other people? Do you not like to be at home alone by yourself on a weekend? You got to be out with other people. Are you outgoing? Or are you more introverted? Do you like to stay by yourself? You're okay, missing the big party so you can stay home and, watch TV or read a book or do whatever. Think about who you are in terms of your personality. Do you like school? Do you hate school? What What are the things that you are interested in? What do you like? What are you like? Are you a nice person? Are you a mean person? Just think about these, various elements that you would consider to be part of your personality. And then think, well, where did they come from? Like, if you are an outgoing person, did you make a decision to become an outgoing person? Well, no, probably not. I mean, maybe you did. Maybe you had this moment where you're like, doggone it, I want to be an outgoing person so that I have more friends. So I'm going to force myself to talk to people. I mean, that may have happened, but likely it did not. So whether you're introverted or extroverted or any other part of your personality, where did it come from? So Sigmund Freud is going to talk about, obviously, the unconscious urges that make you who you are. And here was his theory. He said that there are 3 parts of your mind. Now, these are not physical parts of your brain. These are 3 subsets of your personality. And these are the things that make you who you are. So the first is how you're born. And here we see the clear influence of Charles Darwin on Sigmund Freud. You are an animal. You're like any other animal. You are wired to survive. In order to survive, your body naturally seeks out things that are pleasurable to you. So at a very early age, eating, the process of eating, the process of putting food into your mouth is a very pleasurable and wonderful thing, and your body is wired to want to eat food so that you survive. It's also why if you have very small children, you have to be careful about keeping small objects around, because these small children, all they know is they want to shove things in their mouth, and you got to make sure that you keep things like, Legos away from them so they don't choke. So you're wired to want to eat, which is a pleasurable activity. You are also wired to have sex. You want to have sex because you naturally want to have sex because you need to procreate the species. And so at a very young age, and this is where Freud got very controversial, he talked about infantile sexuality. He said at a very young age, you are driven, you have this urge that drives you. And then, in order to survive, you have to be able to protect yourself. You have to be willing to engage in acts of violence. So this is how you're born. Sigmund Freud called this particular part of your personality the id, id. Id is the Latin word for it, as in the thing. This is this thing that you're naturally born as. You are an animal, wired for sex and wired for violence. You have to have those things. You have to have those urges so that you survive as an animal and so that you procreate and the species survives. Okay, so that's how you're born. But then Sigmund Freud says, you start growing up. And you've got parents and society, and they don't like you behaving in this way of just simply satisfying your instinctual desires. So you start getting disciplined. So your parents and eventually other authority figures in your life start telling you, no, you don't act like that. That's wrong. You say please. You say thank you. You're not just allowed to get up off the dinner table and go do your thing. You have to say, may I be excused, please? If you want something, you say please. Once you're given something, you say thank you. You're not allowed to just do what you want to do. You're going to have chores. You're going to have to behave in a particular way that's respectable, because you, like everybody else, has to live in a society, and we must be kind and respectable to one another. And so, according to Sigmund Freud, you start developing this part of your personality. You learn how to be good, which is in direct conflict for how you're wired to be naturally. Sigmund Freud calls this part of your personality this super ego. And so for these 2 things, let's start with these 2 things. Freud says that right now and at all moments in your life, this is what you're dealing with. You're kind of getting pulled and pushed between these 2 forces. You've got this id inside of you, which wants to dominate, which wants to seek pleasure, which is just this animal. And that's who you are born to be, this wild animal. But you're living in a society. You've got family, friends, responsibilities, and you have to behave in a particular way so that you fit in in society. And these 2 forces are constantly pushing on you, and they are in direct conflict with each other. So you, as a human being, are constantly in this sort of like nervous state of trying to balance out what you're naturally like and what society expects you to be. And in doing this balancing act, that's how you develop the third part of your personality, which is who you are most of the time. Sigmund Freud calls this the ego. Ego is the Latin word for self. So where does your personality come from? Why are some people introverted and some people extroverted? Well, Freud would say it's something that developed unconsciously really early on as a survival mechanism. So, for example, Sigmund Freud says you're an animal, you're born with this rabid desire to have sex. Okay, but it's inappropriate to just walk around expressing that sexual desire. So you have to take that urge, that fundamental instinctual animalistic urge, and find a way to express it in a socially acceptable way. So maybe you dress in a particular way. Maybe you learn how to talk in a particular way, in some way that makes you attractive. So maybe you think, all right, I'll be an athlete. Athletes are attractive, so maybe you're an athlete. Or maybe you are not athletic at all. So you think, okay, well, maybe I'll be a musician. Musicians are attractive, so I have an impulse to play music so that I'm seen as attractive. Okay, but let's say I'm not any good at music. Well, maybe I'll become really smart. I can get a good job, I can make money, I'll be seen in this respectable way. Or, it's the 21st century, maybe I'll present myself in social media in a particular way that makes me seem attractive. Whatever you're doing, however you're behaving or however you're acting, Sigmund Freud says you're trying to balance out these instincts for being seen as attractive, so the sexual impulse, with what society says is acceptable. Violence too. So we're no longer human beings living in the Serengeti defending ourselves against lions, but we are in modern society, and you still have this impulse to be, well, dominant and aggressive. So how do you do that in a way that is socially acceptable? So Sigmund Freud says that is how people unconsciously create their personality or their sense of self, their ego. And then for what it's worth here, Sigmund Freud then identifies mental illness as an inability to balance out the needs of society and the natural impulses. So in the case of Anna O, for example, the reason why she had all these weird hallucinations and these weird behaviors was because, according to Sigmund Freud, her id had been so repressed by these traumatic experiences from her girlhood. Okay, so that's Sigmund Freud's theory of personality. And again, I would just like to reiterate right here, most psychologists today, when they look at this classic Freudian structure of the personality, will not say that this is the end-all be-all of your personality and where it comes from. For example, today we look at a lot of genetics. You are genetically predisposed to behave in a particular way. And you can ask your parents about this because your parents probably raised you to be a particular way. And they're like, they'll tell you. I mean, I can tell you this as a dad of a 2-year-old. My son has a personality that seemingly came out of nowhere. It's certainly not something that's a product of his environment. So genetics play an influence. It's not just you balancing out your natural impulses with the demands of society, like Freud suggested. And there are a lot of other factors that go into your personality development. But this model that Freud presented, it was really foundational in the early days of psychology. And these terms, id, ego, superego, become common parlance among psychologists and really everybody else. And far more than Nietzsche, Freud encourages people to begin thinking about themselves as animals with these animalistic desires. Most of you have read the book The Great Gatsby, and that book was written and published in the year 1925, and Freud was still very much around and active in 1925. And in the book The Great Gatsby, the character of Jordan proclaims, "I'm into Freud and all that." Meaning, Jordan was talking about how she understood how human beings are all naturally animals with these tendencies towards violence and sex. So Freud is extraordinarily influential, especially to the early 20th century and Western culture and civilization. Now, back to this fundamental idea of Freud psychoanalysis, this idea that the unconscious is the driving force in our life, responsible for all of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So I gave you my thought experiments for discovering your unconscious. But for Freud, there was one thing that was infallible proof of the fact that you have an unconscious mind, and that is your dreams. And We sort of have to agree with Freud here. What could be a better indicator that you are not totally in control of your thoughts than the fact that you have dreams? Now, dreams have fascinated humanity since the dawn of humanity. And throughout most of humankind's history, dreams were thought to have been the product of God or angels or demons or something like that. And that sort of makes sense that an angel would deliver a dream to you because dreams are not something that you choose. Now, Freud didn't believe that dreams were something delivered to you by angels or demons or something like that. Freud, even though he was raised a Jew, was himself an atheist as an adult man. He doesn't believe in any type of external spirit world, but he does believe in the unconscious. And he believes that this deeper you within you reveals itself in dreams every night. So you go to bed, you fall asleep, you wake up the next morning, and you remember having a dream. And let's say in your dream, you were flying above the houses in Upper Arlington looking down. Let's say you had that dream. You're flying above the houses of Upper Arlington, looking down, and hey, maybe you see your friends down there, but you're flying around like a bird. And you wake up and you think, wow, what a nice dream. Now, did you choose to have that dream? Did you go to bed that night and say, okay, self, now I'm going to dream tonight when I go to sleep that I'm flying around looking down? Well, probably not. I mean, maybe, but probably not. There are those people that can control their dreams, sort of. They're called lucid dreams when you're able to control your dreams. Freud does not. He's not interested in lucid dreams. That concept of lucid dreaming isn't really studied or talked about at all until the 1970s. For Freud, he's fascinated with the fact that you have dreams and you have no control over them. It's your unconscious trying to tell you something about yourself. So Freud publishes his master work in which he explains the content of your dreams and what particular dreams mean, what your unconscious is trying to tell you. This was an epic book. It's a big book. It's about 500 pages, and it is called, quite simply, The Interpretation of Dreams. If you speak a little German, Die Traumdeutung. Traum is the German word for dream. All right, and a cool thing about the publication of this book, which reveals a little something about Freud's hubris, because Freud was a little cocky. This book, as you see here, has the publication date of the year 1900. But the book was in fact published in the year 1899. But Freud insisted that even though it was published in 1899, that it should print the publication date of 1900 because Freud wanted this to be the very first book of the 20th century. Because Freud believed it was this book that was going to completely revolutionize how human beings thought about themselves in the 20th century. We are not rational creatures. We are a product of unconscious forces, and we could start to understand these unconscious forces by interpreting our dreams. So, Die Traumdeutung, published in 1900, but really 1899. So Freud said, if you really want to understand yourself, well, start paying attention to your dreams and read his book, which will interpret your dreams for you. By the way, spoiler alert, according to Sigmund Freud, pretty much every dream you have is some sexual urge. Every symbol is some sexual symbol. So for example, flying and the exaltation of flying, he says that's sexual because nothing can be more exalting and make you feel so good as sex. And if that's what you're feeling while you're flying, well, then that's clearly a sexual dream according to Freud. If you dream of water, well, water is the source of life, and so is sex. So water is sexual. Everything, in the interpretation of dreams, nearly everything is sexual. So once again, I feel inclined to place Freud within a historical context. Freud is very important because he comes along during the Victorian era, which most people look at it as this very repressive era where people weren't allowed to talk about their sexuality. And Freud brings sex out of the closet. He makes it a topic of polite discussion. And that was probably very healthy and very good for the late 19th, early 20th centuries. But this idea that dreams are just expressing sexual and violent feelings that you have in your conscious life repressed, and that this is your id talking to you, no, there's not a lot of evidence behind that anymore. Now, what dreams are and the function of dreams is still very much a topic of study. And there are a lot of really cool studies on sleeping and dreaming with your overall mental, emotional, and physical health. And starting in the 1970s, we started using brain imaging technology to look at what's going on in people's brains while they're sleeping, while they're dreaming. Actually, I said 1970s. It should have been 1950s when we first started doing that. A guy by the name of Nathaniel Kleitman, he was an American. He started measuring brain waves of people while they slept and then found that there were particular brainwave patterns associated specifically with dreaming. And then in the 1970s, there was another guy named J. Allen Hobson at Harvard who identified exactly where in your brain dreams originated from. There's all this exciting physiological stuff that's been discovered about sleeping and dreaming. But what dreams are and why you dream about certain things, that's still very much a topic of research even still today. But this idea that dreams reflect these unconscious wishes of your primal self, that is not a universally accepted idea anymore. But with Freud, it was the first time we were really talking about these things and investigating them. In the first half of his career, Freud focused most of his writings on how we were seeking pleasure, namely sex, and the unconscious urge for sex. But then, like pretty much everybody in the world, Freud was profoundly affected by the First World War of 1914 to 1918. Freud looked at the First World War and saw it as something completely irrational. It was a war that could have been completely avoided, but it was something that he saw most Europeans embrace with excitement when war first broke out in August of 1914. People were excited for this war, and this war was horrible. For Freud, the First World War was indicative of the fact that we are irrational creatures. We are animals that do not think logically. The fact that we would rush into a war that was completely avoidable. So after the First World War, Freud focused on the violent elements of our unconscious mind. So a couple of Freudian terms here. Freud talked about our desire for sex as an erotic urge, and most of you have heard of that word erotic. But then he said we also have a violent or death-seeking urge, and this urge is called the thanatotic urge. So your unconscious is filled with erotic and thanatotic urges. And the First World War was clearly an expression of humanity's thanatotic urges. And so he wrote about this in response to the First World War in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents. He explored this darker element of human psychology, how you have a suicidal impulse in you. You don't just want to exercise violence over other people as a way of dominating them. You have this suicidal impulse too, this thanatotic urge against yourself. And he wondered why. Why do people have this urge? It doesn't make any sense in terms of evolutionary biology. Why would people want to hurt themselves? And Freud's explanation was, death is a relief from suffering. He found as a psychotherapist that all of his clients had, at some point in time, suicidal fantasies. And the reason why they had these fantasies was because it was an end to suffering, to just be done with life. All right, so hey, that was a lot on Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychology, who is the father of modern psychology because he identified the unconscious as being the driving force of our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. Most of his specific ideas about human personality and behaviors and such have been repudiated. Freud is considered to be an antiquated psychologist, but this fundamental idea of the unconscious as a driving force for thought, feeling, and behavior is still very much with us today and with psychology today. So with that fundamental idea, he's right. Freud is still influential. And Freud is a very important historical figure of the late 19th, early 20th centuries because, like Nietzsche, like Darwin, he describes us human beings as these irrational animals. We're not purely logical creatures. We have irrational impulses. So maybe think about this the next time you make a decision, what you're going to do this weekend, where you're going to go to college, what you're going to wear tomorrow. Are these decisions that you are going to make using only logic and reason, or are these decisions that you are going to make unconsciously, or at least decisions that you make that are influenced by unconscious urges, which you may or may not understand? All right, Sigmund Freud. All right. Hey, I just have to mention this guy. Again, I'm veering off of European history here into American history. Here is our first psychologist. And just like I explained, psychology came out of philosophy. William James was a philosophy professor at Harvard University who developed the field of psychology here in the United States. In the year 1890, he published an epic 2-volume work, The Principles of Psychology. He becomes our first psychology professor at Harvard, of course. If you go to Harvard today and you study psychology in William James Hall at Harvard. William James was sort of interested in the unconscious, but he didn't really think in Freudian terms. William James was more interested in various states of consciousness, as well as attention, as well as altered states of consciousness. So Principles of Psychology was one of his big books. Probably his most lasting and enduring psychological work is a work called On the Varieties of Religious Experience, in which he tries to explain the emotional rapture that people have when they feel that they are in the presence of God or are otherwise having what we would call a religious experience. On the Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. He's our first psychologist. And from what I understand, he was a pretty amazing human being and a great teacher. When he was a professor at Harvard, one of his students was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was at Harvard in the late 1870s, and Roosevelt said of all the professors that he had at Harvard, William James was the best, the most intellectually stimulating, and the most entertaining. All right, so I always just have to throw in William James there, contemporary of Freud's and our first psychologist. All right, now moving away from philosophy and psychology and back into the world of art, we find that art too is moving into the realm of the irrational, and art is embracing the values of modernism. So let's return to art. Now, when it comes to art, one could make the argument that art had to become modernist. It had to reject the traditions of the past because of the invention of this, photography. If prior to the middle of the 19th century, the point of art was to capture reality, well, guess what? Photography is going to do that a lot better. So art, painting at least, has now got to do something more than just capture reality. Now, artwork has never just captured reality. There's always been symbolism. There's always been emotion. But now with the advent of photography, art, and specifically painting, is really challenged to do something new. So here's one of the first photographs ever taken, and it is the first photograph to contain a human being. It's a cool picture if you look at it. It's a picture taken, as you see here, in Paris in 1838. So this was Paris during the time of the July Monarchy, which is kind of cool. And you can find the human being in this photograph on a street corner pumping a water well. Photographs were difficult to take at this point in time in history because the first cameras entailed taking a copper plate, preparing it with a bunch of highly dangerous chemicals, and then there would be a long exposure. You would need a lot of light, and that light would have to make an impression on that copper plate for a long period of time, which is why the very first portraits that we have of people, they are not smiling, because it's really difficult to hold a smile for a long period of time. And the first photographs, they took so long to expose that the person being photographed was instructed, do not smile. So it wasn't that people were angrier in the 19th century, it's just that photography was different and they really couldn't smile. And it's a lot easier to hold a straight face or a frown for a duration of time rather than a smile. Isn't that sad? All right, moving on. In France, during the time of Emperor Napoleon III, there was the National Academy of Fine Arts that would hold their annual salon. And this annual event was to present the greatest artist in France at the time. And if you were an artist in France and you wanted your artwork displayed at this annual salon hosted by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, you had to submit your artwork to the Académie des Beaux-Arts, the National Academy of Fine Arts of France, and they would determine whether or not your art was good enough. This committee of art experts, this committee of men. Well, the majority of people that submitted artwork to the Académie des Beaux-Arts had their artwork rejected. So, in the year 1863, Emperor Napoleon III decreed that there should be a Salon of the Refused, the Salon des Refusés, where all the rejects can have their artwork put on display. Here's some numbers on this particular slide. This was in the year 1863. It was 60% of the artists who submitted work to the Académie des Beaux-Arts who had their art rejected. And so Napoleon III decrees that there should be an art exhibit for all the rejects. And this was the individual, this was the artist that made the greatest impression at the Salon des Refusés. This was his artwork that caused a bit of a stir. It's called The Lunch on the Grass. And here you see 2 men, 2 women who have gone out into the woods for a picnic. One of the women is wading in the water in the background. There seems to be something not proportionally right as to how far out into the water she is, and yet how deep the water seems to be. The woman in the foreground is completely nude, and she's looking at us, the viewer, with this rather nonchalant view. The men are fully clothed and are in a conversation. There is a spilled basket of fruit in the foreground, and a spilled basket of fruit tends to be a symbol of romantic or erotic energy. So this is one of the many paintings at the Salon of the Refused that doesn't seem to be doing a lot of things correctly. First of all, proportion and perspective. These 2 things seem to be, well, not perfect. And an art critic in the middle of the 19th century would have likely said, this is nice. The humans seem to be drawn well enough or painted accurately enough, but this artist needs to work on his technique a little bit here. Then there's the subject matter. Why is this woman completely nude? What's going on here? And here we go. This is modernism. It makes you ask questions. What's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. Why would this artist even paint this scene? What values are we supposed to be taking away from this? It just sort of stirs up in us a little confusion. And then the traditional art critic wants to say, well, this stinks. Proportion and perspective is all wrong. So both in terms of the content and the technique, it's stirring people up a little bit. It's getting people to talk. So we're breaking from the values of the past, or we're challenging the values of the past, and we're stirring people up a little bit in the present. We've created a work of art that's making people talk, and that's what Manet did. The Lunch on the Grass of 1863 from the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused, or the Salon of the Rejected, however you want to interpret that or translate that. A very important work of modernism. And then Manet takes it one step further with Olympia, painted the same year. Whoa, what is going on here? Here we have a completely naked lady who's reclining on a chaise. She has on her shoes, a bracelet, a choker, and a flower in her hair. There's another woman in the painting who's either African or of African descent, who is looking at the woman who's looking at us. And then, if you look closely on the right-hand side of the painting, there's a black cat standing at the end of the chaise. Its tail is up, its back is arched, and it is looking at us. So what is going on in this painting? Well, students, your guess is as good as mine. I cannot interpret Olympia, and I don't know my art history well enough to know what's going on in Olympia. All that I know is that it's pretty shocking. And Manet is giving his audience a lot to be upset about and a lot to talk about. This is modernism. And students, I will confess my ignorance. I've not spent a lot of time researching this particular painting, Olympia. There might be a whole story behind this painting, and I simply do not know it. Feel free to look it up, and if you do find out anything about it, let me know about it. But the one thing I can say about Manet specifically is that he's painting subjects that are designed to shock. He wants the older generation of art critics to look at his work and say, oh, this is immoral. It's wrong. Because Manet wants to usher in a new generation of painters who are willing to challenge convention. Like this guy. So we go from Edouard Manet to Claude Monet. Monet was a French Impressionist painter. Monet was very original in that he wanted to take painting outside. Instead of painting a subject in a studio, he took canvas, easel, and oils outside to set up and paint an outdoor image as he saw it at that particular moment. This is called, in French, en plein air painting. If you would not like to call it en plein air painting, you could just simply call it open air painting. The image that you see on the screen here is a modern version of this. And the point of en plein air painting is to be outside in natural light to try to capture that natural light. Now, today, in the 21st century, We live in a very fast-paced world. We're constantly moving. We tend not to spend too much time in one place, and if we do, we tend to get bored and look at our phones. But if you were outside and you stopped, and you looked at a scene like this, and you stayed there for a while to look at it, what you would find is that things are not staying the same. They're constantly changing because the sun is moving, there's the clouds, the weather, subtle alterations in the atmosphere. So the light is changing, shadows shift, and nothing stays the same for very long. So to do this en plein air painting, Monet painted quickly with fast brush strokes and a focus on capturing the light at that particular moment. The word Impressionism, which describes the artwork that Monet invented, comes from this particular piece of artwork right here, Impression Sunrise, from the year 1872. Please note that we're in the period of time of the French Third Republic. No empire anymore, but rather a republic. And Monet and his friends in the year 1874, they don't care about submitting their work to any salon for the French Academy of Fine Arts to judge. They know what those old geezers are going to say about their artwork. It's going to get rejected. So they simply do their own art exhibit. And in 1874, Monet and several other modernist artists, they hold the first Impressionist art exhibit. The term Impressionism came out of that art exhibit, and in particular from this particular painting, which Monet had entitled Impression Sunrise. And it was an art critic who wrote disparagingly of Monet's work, and it was that art critic that called this type of painting Impressionist painting. But here we see it. You've got a sunrise, you've got some boats, you've got the play of light on the water, you've got the vivid colors in the morning sky, you've got the silhouette of a town and boats in the back. And of course, art critics are going to make fun of this. The forms are all blurry. So for a traditionalist, they would say, well, painters like Monet, they just can't paint. But the thing is, Monet could paint. He was a superior painter from the traditionalist perspective, but he's trying to create something new. He's trying to capture the way light plays upon forms and how that gives us a feeling of transience, about how time is always moving. So hey, let's think like Monet for a second. Stare away from your screen. If you're looking at your computer screen right now or your phone or wherever you're listening to this lecture, quit looking at it. Look up and look around. See what's in the room or wherever you are around you and find the light and the shadow. See the colors. Yeah, so take a moment to do that. And then think about how even in just a few minutes, based upon the time of day, the light, the atmosphere, all that, things are going to change. I mean, as I'm recording this in my office, in my home, and I've got gray walls in my office, but I know that the gray that I'm seeing right now is the gray that's coming out from the evening sun and how that gray is reflecting that evening sun, and that's what I'm seeing. And I know that like in an hour, that gray is going to be a little bit darker because the sun's going down. It's not the same wall. It's really, or at least it's going to look different. And man, so that gives us a sense of the transientness of life, how things are constantly moving, things are constantly changing. And so as I look at it back at Impression Sunrise here on my computer, man, I might think to myself, I'd really like to see it looks like there's two figures on this boat. I'd like to see both of those people. I'd like to see specifically what the boat looks like, but I can't. And that's frustrating. But we can't see things for what they really are. Things are changing, things are moving. And even in real life, if you can take a photograph of something to capture it perfectly, the second after you take that photograph, that thing is already gone. It's already changed. And this transience, I think it, for many people, is accompanied with a sadness. You can't hold on to things. Life is constantly moving. All right, so Impressionism. Let's get a little bit more concrete here for a second, and let's learn the definition of Impressionism. Impressionism can be defined as a late 19th century art movement that focused on the impression of light upon a subject rather than the subject's form. Here's just another Monet that I've got thrown in here. This is obviously of a train station. I believe it is the Gare du Nord, the North train station in Paris. In talking about Monet, there's really two works that I like to talk about that I really feel capture Monet's Impressionism. And the first work isn't a work, but rather it's a series. And it is the Rouen Cathedral series, which Monet painted, as you see here, from 1892 to 1893. Monet lived in the northern part of France, the region of Normandy. Many Americans, if they are familiar with Normandy, it is because of the D-Day invasions of June 6, 1944, when the Americans, the British, and the Canadians invaded the Nazi Empire by taking the beaches of Normandy. And it was up north in that northern part of France where Monet lived as well. So he didn't spend a lot of time in Paris. I mean, he did spend some time in Paris, but Normandy is not too far away from Paris. Paris is also located in the north of France. But Monet enjoyed the countryside far more than the urban city life. The big city in Normandy is Rouen. It is, for what it's worth, historically the same city where Joan of Arc was placed on trial and put on and burnt at the stake back during the 100 Years' War in the 15th century. And in Rouen, there is a big, beautiful cathedral. And Monet would frequently go out, set up his easel in the exact same place, and he would paint the Rouen Cathedral. And here is his first painting of the Rouen Cathedral. He is, of course, focusing on the light and how the light plays upon the form of the cathedral. Now, in the past, an artist would say, all right, I've painted the cathedral. I've shown you what the cathedral looks like. I've painted it as accurately as I could. I'm done. I have no need to ever paint it again. But this is Monet. Monet wants to demonstrate how nothing stays the same. Everything, even a cathedral that's around for thousands of years, even it is always changing in our eyes. So Monet doesn't just paint it once. Take a moment to look at your screen here, if you're not. Monet doesn't just paint it once, he paints it again. And then he paints it again. And then he paints it again. And then he paints it again. Actually, that's the same one, sorry. And he paints it again, showing us how the light is always different, how we're never seeing the same thing twice. And he paints it again, and he paints it again. And then he paints it again, 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 and that's it. Claude Monet, for as much of a modernist and a non-traditionalist as he was, as much as he stirred things up, he was successful enough that he was able to live independently, and he bought a large estate at a place called Giverny. And Giverny, I'm working on my French here, guys. Giverny is a popular tourist destination for a lot of us Americans today, and a lot of other people who are interested in seeing where Monet lived and painted, because it was here in Giverny that he painted his famous water lilies. So a little bit like the Rouen Cathedral, he painted water lilies over and over and over again. And as opposed to the Rouen Cathedral, which is this stable structure, which is there always, water lilies are always floating around and floating around. And he made these monumental paintings of the water lilies, not just like, he didn't just paint the water lilies over and over and over again like he did the Rouen Cathedral, but he painted them in grand proportion like you see here. A multi-canvas, wall-length, magnificent work of art that's just all water lilies. And for me, how I interpret the water lilies paintings is, first of all, rather simply, the colors are beautiful. And those colors strike an emotion. But then the water lilies, right? They're just floating on the water. They're constantly moving. The water is constantly reflecting light in different ways. And for me, and this is totally my own personal interpretation of it, you and I are the water lilies. We're on the pond of life, and nothing is stable. We're constantly being moved around. Everything is always changing. And there's both a beauty and perhaps a sadness to this. But hey, that's just my own interpretation of Monet's water lilies. Monet, certainly one of the most important artists in all of European history. He invented Impressionism, where the focus is not on form, but rather on light. Okay. As you good AP European history students are struggling to learn all of these names, boy, isn't it confusing that you've got a Manet and a Monet who lived pretty much at the same time, although one did technically come before, and I find that this is helpful. Manet he is a pre-impressionist and a modernist. He was the guy at the Salon of the Refused, and Manet comes alphabetically before Monet, who is our impressionist. So hopefully that helps you out a little bit. A comes before O, Manet comes before Monet. Hopefully that helps you out a little bit. Doesn't detract from the fact that you guys have to memorize a bunch of names and information, but hey, welcome to AP Euro. Here's our next modernist painter, Georges Seurat. And I just totally butchered his name while I was looking at it. Georges Seurat. Don't pronounce the T there, Mr. Endres. Georges Seurat. He's French. Seurat was a French painter who, very similar to Monet, was inspired by light. And in particular, he read a book on the physics of light written by this guy, who I just love his picture. I mean, the guy looks like a mad scientist. We don't have to know who this guy is, but Seurat read his book and was fascinated by the idea of how colors relate to each other. Now, what Seurat did was he became a different type of impressionist, so much so that the word impressionism doesn't actually apply to Seurat. And as you look at this particular portrait that Seurat painted, it's clear what he's doing. Monet did brush strokes. Seurat is clearly making very big dots with the point of his paintbrush, so that Seurat's work all looks like a poorly pixelated photograph. Now, the one thing that makes Seurat's work similar to Monet's and the other Impressionists is that you don't get a clear form. Again, you sort of want that like photograph-like precision in art, and it's not there. So you can sort of see the form, but you can't get it precisely. But then what comes out of that is a particular image, a particular feeling, and a particular emotion. So Impressionism doesn't exactly describe Seurat's work. Instead, we have a different word, another French word. It is pointillisme. My French is correct there, pointillisme. But let's just be Americans and call it pointillism. And that should be a relatively easy word to remember because you have points. You have these spots in Seurat's work. So pointillisme is a branch of Impressionism that uses points instead of brushstrokes to create an image. Probably, without a doubt, Seurat's most famous work is this one, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. Yes, it's a bit of a mouthful. Let's just call it A Sunday Afternoon. This great wall-sized work of art is not in Paris. It's not in France. It's in Chicago. And back in the 1980s, when I was in my early teens, there was the great teen movie maker John Hughes, who filmed all of his movies in Chicago. And in one of his movies, called Ferris Bueller's Day Off, this most famous of all of Seurat's work made an appearance. And as I show you this work, I'm going to do exactly what John Hughes did, but just not to the same wonderful effect. With pointillism, like with Impressionism, we yearn to see a form, but we can't have it. But when we look at the painting like this, well, we can sort of see exactly what's going on here. But we get closer, things start to get more distorted. And as we get closer, things start to get more distorted and more distorted and more distorted and more distorted and more distorted. And we want to see what's really there, but we can't. A Sunday Afternoon by Georges Seurat. There's a lot that's going on here in this particular painting. There's a lot that is open to interpretation. There's some symbolism in it. One of the more interesting things, if you take a look at it, on the right-hand side, you see that there is a man walking a woman who's holding a parasol or a cute little umbrella. And note that she is walking a monkey. So at her feet, there's a little dog playing around and a monkey. What's that monkey mean? Must be symbolic for something. Moving on. Paul Gauguin is our next modernist painter inspired by Impressionism, but really branches off to create his own different type of artwork that inspires future generations. Paul Gauguin's influence can be seen well into the 20th century. Paul Gauguin lived a very interesting life. He was a husband and a father and a family man, and not an artist, but a stockbroker. So definitely not your typical artist. Here's a guy who understood investment banking. But then he got tired of his ordinary bourgeois life, and he wanted to break off and go free. So he left his wife and his family, moved to Paris, hung out with Impressionists, began painting, began selling his paintings. The money that he made from his paintings did not go back to his family, but Gauguin decided to live wild and free, and most of that money went to alcohol and prostitutes. Of all the modernist painters that were there in Paris, France, in the late 19th century, the one that really befriended Paul Gauguin and wanted to live together with Paul Gauguin in an artist commune in the south of France was a young Dutch painter named Vincent van Gogh, or as we Americans tend to pronounce his name, Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh loved Gauguin, not in the romantic sense, but in the sort of like, you're an incredible painter, I want to be a great painter like you. And Vincent van Gogh, so innocent, so kind, such a loving person. And Paul Gauguin was not. And Paul Gauguin made fun of Vincent van Gogh and his lack of ability to sell his artwork. Paul Gauguin eventually ran away from France entirely. He wanted to live wild and free, and no better place to do that than in the South Pacific, in the island of Tahiti. So Paul Gauguin moved to Tahiti, leaving behind his family, his friends, and everything, well, everything but his paints, so that he could go to Tahiti to paint Tahitians, mostly women, in a very non-traditional way. He wants to break from European tradition, and he wants to paint a little bit in this more primal fashion with a focus on color. So with Gauguin's painting like this one, I'm sorry, I don't have a title for Gauguin's painting. You do have a clear form. It's a naked woman, and then a beautiful Tahitian background behind her, but even far more than Manet, there's no perspective. Things are out of proportion. I mean, look at the size of the woman's feet and her hand. But there's this sort of innocent, childlike beauty in Gauguin's painting. So it's this rejection of the traditional notions of perfection, and what you have replacing that is sort of this warmth, this innocence, and this beautiful color of this faraway place. So if you're European and you look at this, you're like, wow, talk about getting away from it all. Here's Tahiti, and here's a rejection of traditional European society. Here's another painting of two Tahitian women by Gauguin. All right. And so Gauguin inspired a type of painting called Fauvism. And one of the 20th century painters who was inspired by Gauguin was a French painter named Henri Matisse. I don't have any Matisse's work here just because I've got so many artists. I decided to leave out Matisse. But Matisse and another painter named Joan Miró, who is Spanish, they could both be categorized as Fauvist painters. So this is what Gauguin inspired, Fauvism. Fauve is the French word for savage. So Fauvism is painting like a savage or like a primitive. There's a focus on bright colors, and there's form, but the forms are drawn in this very childlike, or from the European perspective, primitive way. All right, and that's Fauvism. Now let's talk about Gauguin's friend, Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh is the correct way to pronounce his name, and here's where I'm just going to apologize. I grew up learning his name as being Vincent van Gogh, and that's just what comes out when I talk. And so I am going to call him Vincent van Gogh. All right, Vincent van Gogh was Dutch, although most of the painting that he did in France. But if you want to go to the Vincent van Gogh Art Museum, you've got to go to Amsterdam. And I highly recommend that visit if ever you're in Amsterdam. And what makes that art museum for me really neat is that all of Van Gogh's paintings are lined up chronologically. So you can think of it as a biographical lineup of his work. The museum presents the art and the order in which Van Gogh painted it. And so for me, and I've only been to that Van Gogh museum once in my life, and I was only 22 years old, but what was neat about it was the further you go, man, the cooler the artwork gets. It becomes more and more Van Gogh-like. It becomes more energetic, more bright, more colorful, more wonderful. Some of his early paintings were kind of dark and grimy. And then you get to those later paintings that he did at the end of his life before he died, and man, it was just those paintings are just an explosion of energy. And then it's really cool to see the real paintings because you get to see the actual paint on the canvas, and the paint is thick. It's in globs, and you just don't get that on a computer screen or even in a nice art book. If you want to really experience a Van Gogh or a Van Gogh painting, man, you've got to see it. There's no other way. All right, so Vincent van Gogh. You know, a lot of people think of Vincent van Gogh as the example of the mad genius, somebody who was mentally and emotionally very unstable and yet was able to churn out masterpieces. He's also this example for a lot of people as somebody who lived well before his time. He was a visionary. He was never recognized for his genius during his lifetime, but now he's considered to be one of the greatest painters of all time. His work sells for the tens of millions. Okay, but who was Vincent van Gogh? Well, throughout his life, he was a very passionate individual. Originally, he wanted to be a minister, but he failed as a minister because, and this is funny, he was too much of a zealot. He was too passionate about being religious, and he alienated the congregations that he was speaking to. Some art historians say he never stopped being a minister. His artwork is in fact a delivery of the vision of another world, designed to have you feel a spiritual rapture, which is kind of a cool way to think of Vincent van Gogh. He did move to Paris. He did spend time with Paul Gauguin and some of the other great painters of the late 19th century. He then did move to the south of France. He did spend time in a mental institution. Yes, he did cut off not his entire ear, but part of an ear and gave it to a young woman who he was in love with. I believe, but you can check me on this, that she was a prostitute. So yes, Vincent van Gogh struggled with depression, but he was released from that mental institution. And he was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily kind man. It had long been thought that he died from suicide. But within the last 10 years, historians have looked at the police report of Van Gogh's supposed suicide, and there's a lot that doesn't make sense. So Vincent van Gogh did die of a gunshot wound to the gut. And that has made some historians go, what? That doesn't make sense. I mean, if you were going to commit suicide and you had a gun, would you point the gun at your stomach? It took Vincent van Gogh a while to die, and dying from a gunshot wound to your guts is not a pleasant way to go. There's a lot of suffering that's involved. And a policeman was able to get Vincent van Gogh's testimony. And Van Gogh, while he was dying, said some strange things like, "I killed myself, don't blame anybody else." But there was no suicide note. By all accounts, he was having a fine day that day. So now one of the theories is, and again, this is just a theory, but for me, even though I'm only a humble high school history teacher, this theory seems to be, I don't know, at least substantial. Vincent van Gogh was shot by a young man, likely a teenage boy, who himself was mentally unstable. And as Van Gogh lay dying, he didn't want to get that kid into trouble. So Van Gogh's death was reported as a suicide. And the fact that Van Gogh had himself suffered from depression because Van Gogh himself had been institutionalized, that when news of this suicide reached Paris, those people that knew Van Gogh were willing to believe it. Didn't seem to be that much of a stretch to imagine Vincent van Gogh killing himself, even though at that particular time in his life, he was actually doing just fine. All right. Vincent van Gogh is sometimes labeled a post-impressionist or an expressionist. Let's get a definition here for expressionism, and I'll give you an official definition here, and then I'll give you my informal definition. Here's the good one. Expressionism can be defined as an art movement that distorts reality to create a powerful emotional response in the viewer. And that's pretty straightforward. An art movement that distorts reality to create a powerful emotional response in the viewer. Here's how I think of expressionism. So pardon me as I give you my slant on all this stuff, but I hope it helps. I think of expressionism as impressionism. We start with impressionism. Those broad brush strokes, trying to focus on light and not form. So it's an impressionist painting, but the light is vibrant and it's shimmering and it's got this powerful radiant quality. And so as opposed to the more gentle paintings of Impressionism, man, expressionism just comes out and grabs you. So here is one of Vincent van Gogh's paintings. Most of his paintings today are extraordinarily famous, so you've probably seen both of the two Van Goghs I'm going to show you here. This particular painting is called The Starry Night on the Rhone. The Rhone is the name of the river here. And so the stars in the sky, those aren't stars like Monet would paint stars. I actually don't know if Monet actually ever painted stars. His paintings were all done in the daytime, but I'm sure if he did, they wouldn't look like this. These stars are like not just lights, not just blurry lights like I would imagine an impressionist would paint them, but rather these stars are alive and it's almost like they're reaching out, they're coming to get you. The city on the banks of the Rhone, those lights are alive, they're coming out to get you, the way that the Rhone River is reflecting those lights. And the grass and the air, it's flowing, it's blowing, it feels very alive and energetic, like infused with a spirit. Now that's Starry Night on the Rhone, but when most people think of Starry Night, this is the painting that they think about. This is The Starry Night, painted in 1889. Vincent van Gogh painted it while he was in a mental institution. This is what he saw as he looked out of his window at the town nearby. This painting is also no longer in France. Since the early 1940s, this has been here in the United States at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And it's there permanently. So yes, you can see this if ever you go to New York. All right, The Starry Night. So here you see how it's clearly something beyond Impressionism. Van Gogh is not trying to capture the way the light plays on things. What he's trying to capture is the energy of the sky pre-dawn. Things are moving, things are alive. And like I said before, to really get a good feel of this particular painting, you cannot just look at it on the screen like you see here. You've got to see the real thing in New York City where the paint is just thick. You've got to think of this almost as like a relief sculpture. It's 3D. And that gives you even more of a sense of the energy of this particular painting. It's beautiful. It comes out and it grabs you. And I think people who like Starry Night like it because one of the things they feel is that, well, the night sky in the city, in the tree, it's all something that's alive. It's like the universe, everything in the universe. It's all alive. There's nothing that's inanimate. There's nothing that's dead. It's all alive, it's all energy, and we're a part of it. The Starry Night is like the universe giving you a hug. It's all alive and we're all in it together. All right. So those are the two paintings that I'm going to show you from Vincent van Gogh, or to say his name more properly, Vincent van Gogh. So Vincent van Gogh is the author of, for me, one of the most touching and beautiful quotes from any artist of any genre in all of European history. No, all of world history. I love this quote. So, background to this quote. We today are really lucky because Vincent van Gogh wrote a lot. He had a brother that he was very close with. Throughout his entire life, he was close to his brother. His brother's name was Theo. And Theo was a successful middle-class man who would send Vincent money and paints, and he would also try to find sellers for Vincent van Gogh's work. So Theo, the brother, took care of Vincent. Theo lived a very different life. He had a wife, he had a family. Vincent never had either of those things. And the two brothers exchanged letters incessantly. So pretty much Vincent van Gogh wrote his autobiography by sending his brother all these letters from when he was in France. And in this one letter, which was dated July the 21st, 1882, Van Gogh was reflecting upon his artwork and the way people saw him and his artwork. Now remember, today Vincent van Gogh is thought of as one of the greatest artists of all time. During his lifetime, he was mocked, even by the artists that knew him, like Paul Gauguin. He was unable to sell his artwork. He was placed in a mental institution for emotional instability. He was a loner who really struggled with the fact that nobody thought much of him. And he writes about that and the art that he's trying to create in this one letter to his brother. So here's what Vincent wrote to his brother Theo on July the 21st, 1882. What am I in the eyes of most people? A non-entity, an eccentric, or an unpleasant person. Somebody who has no position in society and will never have. In short, the lowest of the low. All right then. Even if that were absolutely true, then I should one day like to show by my work what such an eccentric, such a nobody, has in his heart. That is my ambition, based less on resentment, but rather on love, in spite of everything, based more on a feeling of serenity than on passion. Though I am often in the depths of misery, there is still calmness, pure harmony, and music inside me. I see paintings or drawings in the poorest cottages, in the dirtiest corners, and my mind is driven towards these things with an irresistible momentum. This quote is not just loved by me. There are a lot of people who see this as perhaps the most powerful thing that Vincent van Gogh ever wrote, and especially the first part of it where he talks about, even if I am the lowest of the low, this non-entity, this eccentric, let me show you what I have in my heart. And it's just this great testimony to existence, to being, no matter who you are. Vincent and his brother Theo were extraordinarily close. And after Theo found out that Vincent had supposedly committed suicide, he himself went through this strange psychological and physiological deterioration. And Theo himself was admitted into a mental institution and then died, not even 1 year later. It's a sad story, but it's also the story of two brothers that loved each other very much. All right. Cezanne. Our next modernist painter, and boy, is he a doozy, Paul Cézanne. Paul Cézanne grew up in the French countryside. He was buddies, total coincidence, he was buddies growing up with Émile Zola. But whereas Émile Zola grew up and they both went to Paris together, they artistically, once they got to Paris, went on completely different directions. Zola, as a writer, became a naturalist writer, so he's trying to focus on the reality, the griminess of life. And Paul Cézanne gets as abstract as you can get in the late 19th century. So Paul Cézanne is also considered a post-impressionist or an expressionist. Let me show you an example of Cézanne's work. Here it is. Let's look at this. All right, Cézanne's supposed to be one of the greatest painters of the late 19th century. What are we looking at here? What are we looking at here? Take a moment and try to figure it out. All right, now if you're thinking to yourself, well, it kind of looks like in the background there's a mountain, and then there's the landscape leading up to the mountain in the foreground there. Well, you would be correct. This is a painting by Cézanne of a mountain. But then you think to yourself, this is not complete. There's a bunch of empty space there. Why didn't he finish the painting? And for Cézanne, that's the point. This is an unfinished work, or the word that's used in the world of the arts is the Italian word non finito, unfinished. So you think to yourself, well, that's stupid. Why doesn't he finish the painting? Well, because Cézanne and many of the other modernists would say the painting doesn't have to be finished because you can already figure out what it is. Your brain has the capacity to fill in the gaps. So even that mountain in the background there, at least the cap of the mountain, is just a few lines with some brush strokes of cloud and sky behind it. That's all you need to figure out that this is a mountain. So what's this mean? Why is Cézanne doing this? Well, the reason why Cézanne is held in such reverence today as this great modernist artist is not just because he's non-traditional. It's not just because, well, we've got cameras now to take actual pictures of mountains, and so let's do something different in painting. What he's showing both us right now and artists back then is that the brain, our brains, are capable of putting things together in such a way to create an image that actually isn't there. And this opens up a world of possibility in terms of the arts. Painters don't have to paint something precise. I mean, not only do we have photographs to do that now, but look, painters can do something different because our brains are capable of seeing things that aren't even there. We can piece things together. So now can artists paint things in such a way that we, the viewers, can construct an image in our own mind's eye that isn't even there in the painting. No photograph can do that. So this opens up a world of possibilities. Here's another painting by Cézanne, and I apologize, students, a little bit like Gauguin, or exactly like Gauguin, I don't have an actual title for this particular work. But check it out. It's a still life. It shows fruit and a bottle and some breadsticks on a table, and there is sort of a tablecloth crumpled up and draped over the front of the table. So that's what we see. Okay. As you look at this painting, you're like, okay, sort of impressionist, got some brush strokes there. Things seem kind of splotchy, not a whole lot of detail given to, or at least not a whole lot of focus given to the detail of the breadsticks or the fruit. So it might have this primal, childlike, fauvist quality to it. Perspective seems a little off. But then here's something else, and hopefully the way I describe this makes sense. Hopefully you can see this. Look at the table. All right. Now look at the front of the table, the part where the tablecloth kind of drapes down the front of it. Okay. So now looking at the tablecloth and the way it drapes down the front of the table, look to the right of the tablecloth. And do you see the side of the table there? Okay. Now look to the left of the tablecloth. The side of the table is not the same. It's almost like when you're looking at the left side of the cloth, it's sort of like you're looking straight down at the table. Whereas on the right side of the tablecloth, it's almost like you're sitting down lower, looking at the actual side of the table. But either way, it's different. And either way, it doesn't really matter to your mind. You still look at this and you see the same thing. Never mind that it's proportionally out of whack. Our brains can totally make sense of it. And that's what Cézanne is doing. He's showing us that our brains can make sense out of things that technically don't make sense. And this liberates art. Or, in the words of the 20th century artist Pablo Picasso, Cézanne is the father to us all. So if you understand Cézanne and how he uses non finito, how Cézanne breaks from painting anything in a traditional way just to show us that our minds can see what's intended to be seen by the artist. Once you understand that, then Picasso starts to make sense. So here's Pablo Picasso, probably one of the greatest painters of the 20th century. He was from Spain, although he spent most of his life living in Paris, France, because he hated his home country of Spain, or at least so he said, even though probably his greatest painting that we will learn about in a future lecture on the Spanish Civil War is about Spain. But never mind that for now. He was born and raised in Spain, goes to Paris, France, because that's where all great artists have to go. He lived from 1881 till 1973. Oh, Picasso died the same year I was born. And he is one of the founders of Cubism. What's Cubism? Cubism can be defined as a 20th century art movement that first disassembles, then reassembles a subject, presenting that subject from multiple perspectives. So check this out. Actually, no, let me go back to the definition. Make sure you guys have a chance to get it down. All right, so what do the cubists do? Well, in the word cubism, you see the word cube, which is of course a three-dimensional object. And so thinking of that three-dimensional object of a cube does give you at least the feel for what cubist art is like. It feels very three-dimensional, even though it's a two-dimensional painting. Okay, so it was developed in the 20th century, and what the cubists do is they take a subject that they want to paint, like the image that you're going to see next is a girl with a mandolin. So you take that image, and you have the face of the girl, the arm of the girl, the mandolin. You kind of take those pieces apart, and you kind of unfold each of those parts, create a three-dimensional image, and then you reassemble those things in a way that you can see the face, the arm, the mandolin from multiple perspectives. And so you have something like this. So here is Girl with a Mandolin, painted by a younger Picasso in the year 1910. And you look at this and it's nothing like anything a photograph would ever be able to take, but you can clearly see that it is a female holding a mandolin. You can see it. Your brain is putting all this together. So hopefully if you know Cezanne, it makes sense how Cezanne influenced Picasso. Picasso is just taking it to an extreme. And Picasso uses color and shading to give a particular feel to the image. So art is going in a direction that photography could never. Picasso's Cubism. Picasso, his personal life. Picasso received a great deal of notoriety and fame at a fairly young age. He was considered to be a great artist, and Picasso reveled in celebrity. And one of the things that he reveled in was the fact that so many women adored him. He enjoyed that aspect of celebrity, which is why in his personal life, he enjoyed bouncing around from one lover to another lover to another lover, sometimes having multiple lovers at the same time. So needless to say, there was a lot of emotional drama in Picasso's life. It probably wouldn't have been as bad had he not chosen to marry women and then be unfaithful to them, but that's what he did. Now, from Picasso's perspective, he said this element of his personal life is what it inspired him artistically. That meeting a new young lover inspired him to paint, and that if ever he felt trapped in a relationship, this was detrimental to his artistic abilities. So take this particular image right here. Pablo Picasso wanted to get out of a relationship, so he goes up to his then girlfriend and tells her that he's leaving her for a 16-year-old girl, and she breaks down in tears. Picasso, inspired by this, wants to capture the pain and the agony of his lover, or former lover, in this three-dimensional image, which is really, of course, only two dimensions, but the eyes, the nose, the face, the mouth, the hands, the tears, by showing all of these things from seemingly different angles in a way that is completely inconsistent with reality and what a photograph would show, but can communicate incredibly powerful emotion. That's what Picasso does. Picasso is considered to be one of the greatest painters of the 20th century because he was one of the most innovative painters of the 20th century. The subject of most of his artwork is very ordinary, everyday things, although he does tend to paint women, and clearly Picasso's personal obsession with women is revealed in his artwork. But throughout the course of Picasso's life, he will paint one painting that will be very different from the rest. It will be very political, and it will also be very Spanish. And we will learn about it in a future lecture. All right, and now we turn to science. New discoveries in science, and especially in the field of physics, had an impact on the arts as well as on European culture in general. One of the most incredible discoveries of the late 19th, early 20th centuries was that of the atom. And what did we find out in the late 19th and early 20th century about the atom? I mean, the ancient Greeks had conceptualized the atom, but now we can finally see this fundamental building block of the universe. And what do we find out about this fundamental building block of the universe? Well, we find out it's not a building block at all. The atom really isn't a thing, but rather mostly empty space with a few subatomic particles that are held together by a very powerful force called atomic energy. And things are going on at the subatomic level that seem to defy Newton's law of motion. Ooh, so we've got an anomaly again. Way back in the late 17th century, as you hopefully well remember, Newton had given us in the Principia this airtight, perfect description of how everything in the universe moves, no matter where in the universe you are. There are those fundamental 3 laws of motion. But now, at the dawn of the 20th century, when we look at this most small of things, this atom, weird things are going on there. With an atom, you've got protons and neutrons and electrons. The protons and the neutrons are in the very center of it, and going around the protons and neutrons, you've got the electrons. And the electrons do weird things. They sort of bounce around and they sort of disappear and reappear. And this new discovery and this new field of study that they called quantum mechanics shook things up a little bit, just like Darwin's theory of evolution a half a century before. Because it defies what we see. We look around and we see hard stuff. We're made up of hard stuff. When you walk up to a door and you knock on the door and you feel your knuckles hit that wood, that's hard stuff. But now what modern physics is teaching us is that it's not hard stuff, that our knuckles and that door are held together by this incredibly powerful energy, and that when we get down to this really small level of life, nothing is solid. It's all just this energy, which is kind of mysterious, hard to measure, and that when we knock on the door and all of our human senses tell us that it's solid, what's really going on there are atoms reacting to each other. It's a weird world, the world of quantum mechanics, and it will influence the arts, as we'll see here in a bit. And then at the dawn of the 20th century, this guy comes along, probably the most famous scientist of the 20th century and one of the most famous scientists of all time. The German-turned-American scientist, and he was a physicist, Albert Einstein. We were able to acquire Albert Einstein, and more specifically, Princeton University was able to acquire Albert Einstein after he, because he was Jewish, had to run away from Nazi Germany. But in the early 20th century, he had made famous discoveries like his famous equation, E equals mc squared. He had developed the theory of relativity. But the way I talk about Albert Einstein in terms of how he fits into the story of science in European history is I focus on what he discovers about light. So if we look at the whole history of science, and we look at advancements in science being made by there being an anomaly that nobody can explain, and then along comes somebody who can explain the anomaly, but they have to develop an entirely new paradigm in order to do it. Light is an anomaly in the Newtonian model of movement in the universe because light doesn't seem to behave in the same way that everything else does. So when you're in your physical science class or your physics class and you're studying things like acceleration, friction, movement, velocity, these types of things, light doesn't behave in the same way as marbles rolling down the floor do. And what Einstein discovers is that when things speed up to the speed of light, strange things start happening. Time starts getting altered and mass starts changing. So these two things that physicists and scientists and pretty much everybody had always thought were standard things, fixed things in the universe, mass and time, are in fact not fixed. They're not the standard. Light is the standard. Okay, now, again, I'm just a stupid high school history teacher. Hopefully, my very simplistic explanation of light and mass and time sort of are a fair summary of one of Einstein's theories, but there we go. That's what I've got for you. Light is the new standard. Time can speed up or slow down relative to light, and mass can be altered relative to light. That's what I've got. Hope it makes sense. All right, so let's talk about the impact of science on art. And here is another very famous and another very important Spanish painter. His name was Salvador Dali, as opposed to Picasso. And he was different from Picasso in a couple of, well, more than a couple, but he was different from Picasso in several fundamental ways. Picasso ran away to Paris. Dali spent time in Paris, but he loved Spain and spent most of his life in Spain. He was an icon and a celebrity, known for his famous mustache, as you see here. He also spent quite a bit of time in the United States as well. Now, one way that we can understand Salvador Dali is as an artist who wanted to take the new discoveries of science and to represent those new discoveries artistically. All right, and I'll give you some examples of that. Now, of all the new discoveries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that inspired Dali, without a doubt, the most influential one was the discovery of the unconscious mind. That might not be a fair thing to say, that the unconscious was discovered in the late 19th century, but certainly it was explored, and Freud tried to understand what the unconscious was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Dali wanted to create artwork, and did create artwork, in which the unconscious mind was revealed. So much of his artwork is going to look a lot like a dream, and this dreamlike artwork has an aim: surrealism. Surrealism comes from the French word surreal, which means above reality. And so our definition of surrealism is this: surrealism is a 20th century art movement that distorts reality to create a dreamlike image and focuses on unconscious impulses. Surrealism is artwork that looks like a dream. This is probably one of Dali's most famous paintings, The Persistence of Memory. And so definitely take a moment to look at your screen as I talk about Dali's artwork here. Chances are you've seen The Persistence of Memory. There are all these melting clocks. And there are several other little things, like a branch of a tree, a timepiece covered with flies. In the center, is that a dead bird? Or is that a sort of a death shroud wrapped over a human face? There are cliffs in the background. There are all these things, and they're all very accurately painted. It's not like Dali was an impressionist or an expressionist. He paints very precisely, just weirdly. So you have to look at these things and you have to think, okay, what does that mean? When we look at the melting clocks, we wonder, what does that mean? We have to interpret these particular images in much the same way that Sigmund Freud would interpret an image in a dream. So if we had a dream of a melting clock and we were discussing that dream with Sigmund Freud or whoever our psychoanalyst was, the psychoanalyst would provide an interpretation for what that melting clock would mean, what unconscious urge it represented. And so you sort of have to do the same thing in Dali's paintings. You look at these strange things and you try to come up with an interpretation. And so this is The Persistence of Memory. And this is one of the most famous Dali paintings. And I tell you what, students, I don't know why this is one of his most famous paintings. For me, it's not one of his greatest ones. Maybe his one just doesn't, enrapture me like some of Dali's other works do. The melting clocks thing, I think that captivates a lot of people. The idea that time is fluid. Certainly we've all been in situations where we felt stuck and that time can't move fast enough. And other times we're having so much fun, time passes and we're like, wow, where did the time go? So this subjective experience of time, I think that's how a lot of people interpret the fluidity of these clocks here, or rather the melting clocks here, is the fluidity of time. Dali himself, who talked a lot about his paintings and gave us a lot of insight into his paintings, so he did a lot of interpretation for us. When he talked about this particular painting, he said he was inspired by the melting clocks when he was eating outdoors, having a picnic of some sort, and he saw cheese on a picnic table or a table outdoors, but he saw cheese on a table outside, and the cheese started melting. And Dali, probably the way only Dali could be, was enraptured by this melting cheese. And he had this vision as the cheese being clocks that were telling the time, and as the time wore on, the cheese/clocks were melting. So that's the one thing that Dali gave us when describing this very famous image, the persistence of memory. But there's a lot here that's captivating and open to interpretation. That white image in the center, is it a dead bird? Is it a shroud over a face? You can kind of see multiple things in it, and that's a very Dali-esque quality. You look at one thing, but you can see multiple things. And for me, there's no better example of that than in this particular painting. Now, this is one that's maybe not as famous as The Persistence of Memory, but man, do I love it. I love talking about this particular painting. I'm proud to say I've seen this particular painting in the original version. It's huge, it's wall-sized, and I'm going to explain to you one of the dual images in it, and when it popped out at me, wow, I was blown away by it. All right, so let's look at this particular piece of artwork by Salvador Dali. It is called The Hallucinogenic Toreador. A toreador is a bullfighter. Okay, so check out this painting. There's a lot going on in it. There are flies, there are other animals, there are flowers. There seems to be some classical architecture in the background with arches. But hopefully the one thing that starts to reveal itself to you are the images of the classical sculpture of Venus. And you see several Venuses lined up and in various places throughout this piece of artwork. Venus is nude from the waist up and then seems to be draped from the waist down. Okay, so I would like to focus in on a dual image in this particular painting. So I've circled one of the Venuses here. So look at your screen, see the Venus that I've circled, and hopefully you can see the Venus okay. You see her face, her breasts, this sort of like gash thing across her belly, and then she's draped in white and green from the waist down. So hopefully you can see that clearly enough. She's shaded kind of weird. The shadows on her belly and on her face don't really seem to be consistent, and there's a reason for that. This is a dual image. You're not just looking at a Venus here, you're also looking at a bullfighter. This is the hallucinogenic toreador buried in this painting. Okay, so let me try to help you see this toreador because it's really fun when it pops out at you. And for me, this is what makes Dali just a genius of a painter, the fact that he could envision something like this and paint it. All right, so you see the Venus. Her face is the right eyeball of the toreador. Her left breast is the nose of the toreador. All right, going a little bit lower, that gash across the belly, that's the mouth of the toreador. Go a little bit further down. The green part of the wrap around her is the tie, the necktie of the toreador. Okay, so looking at those things, let me erase the circle. Look at the painting as a whole, focus in on that particular image of Venus, and then following those cues, let the bullfighter come into view. There he is. Do you see him? Hopefully you do. If not, just pause or rewind, listen to my description again, and hopefully you see it. Because when you see it, you're like, whoa, 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 there it is. And this hidden image pops out at you, and you realize the toreador is like the whole painting, or at least a significant part of the painting. And then for me, it's kind of cool because I look at the face of the Venus, the face which is the right eyeball of the toreador, and you're like, oh, wow, that eyeball, it's kind of complex. It's kind of a sad eye a little bit. And then the left eyeball of the toreador, it's right where you have the space in between the chest and the upper right arm of the next Venus, the big one to the far right of the painting. And so that's where his other eye would be. And her waistline makes up his cheek line, and it all just starts coming together. Now for me, this is brilliant. This is amazing. I do not know how anybody could conceive painting something like this. And so not only is there all this stuff going on, which is influenced by Freud's theory of the unconscious, all these flies and bees and Venuses and Greek architecture and other images that I can't even get into here. You can take all this and try to interpret it and understand what it is and why things are arranged in the way that they are. But for me, the big thing in this painting is the hallucinogenic Toreador, this bullfighter whose image is buried in all of this, it's buried in all this craziness. But then you see it and boom, it pops out at you. So, okay, the hallucinogenic Toreador. Okay, again, if you ever have to write about Salvador Dali or use Dali as an additional document, the great thing to do is to talk about the influence of Sigmund Freud upon his work. Sigmund Freud interpreted dreams and the symbols that are in our dreams, and Dali painted artwork that looks like a dream, that's filled with all of this symbolism. All right. Back to this particular painting specifically, I mentioned how I've seen this one, and it's pretty practical for you to see it too, although it would take a little bit of traveling. You don't actually have to leave the country. So there are 3 big Dali museums in the world. One is in his native Spain. The second is in Paris, France, in the very touristy Montmartre neighborhood of Paris, France. And the third is this one, the Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. And it's a really cool museum. Now, I have not been there since it's been renovated to look like this. I was there in the mid-90s. They have funkified the architecture to make it look more Dali-like. But it's in this particular museum that the hallucinogenic Toreador is housed. And like I said, it's huge. So when I was having somebody describe it to me and show me where the Toreador was in this particular painting and it popped out at me, I was actually on a staircase looking over at the wall where it's hanging. I don't know if you can do that with a new remodel of the building, but I mean, I had to be up sort of off the ground. I was on the staircase looking at this huge painting on the wall. And the fact that it was just such a big painting, it really left this powerful impression on me. So there you go. Next time you're in Florida, if you're near St. Petersburg, go to the Dali Museum. For me, one of the cool things about the Dali Museum is that it's right on the Gulf. And so when I left the Dali Museum, there were docks right there, and there were boats right there, and there were dolphins splashing around. And I thought, oh, you know what? I think Salvador Dali would really like this. Dolphins splashing around an art museum for him just seemed very Dali-like. Dolphins. All right. So Sigmund Freud was an influence on Salvador Dali, but he certainly wasn't the only influence. So let me take a moment here to contrast Salvador Dali in his personal life with Pablo Picasso and his personal life. So Pablo Picasso would move on from woman to woman to woman to woman, never being faithful to any of them, and Salvador Dali was the exact opposite of that. He fell in love at a very young age to a woman named Gala, and Salvador Dali obsessed over Gala his entire life, including her in many, 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 many paintings. So in this next image I'm going to show you, we will see one of Dali's many images of his wife Gala. But in this particular image that I'm going to show you, it's also a great example of how a scientific discovery influenced art. So Dali himself was really interested in modern science, would actually take time to go and meet with science professors and talk to them about the new things that are being discovered, ask questions about the new things that are being discovered. And Dali was mildly interested in the fact that everything in the universe is composed of atoms, but when we look at individual atoms, to the extent that we can look at individual atoms, there's not much there. It's energy, atomic energy, that's holding everything together. And much the same way that gravity holds our solar system together. And that in both cases, most of it's just empty space with little particles in it, held together by this powerful energy. So I could only imagine what was going on in Dali's brain as he's learning about this stuff. Things aren't solid. Things are held together by energy. So I can only imagine what was going on in his brain as he heard this, and how Dali's eyes were probably lighting up. But anyway, he took this idea, this fundamental idea of quantum mechanics, and he creates a quantum mechanics inspired portrait of his wife. And here it is. Again, for me, brilliant. How did he do this? And this one doesn't take too much interpretation. I don't think there's any hidden image to be discovered. The image itself is sort of I don't even know how to explain it. Just look at it. So the title of this work is called Galatea of the Spheres, or Galatia of the Spheres. Galatea is a character from classical mythology that I know nothing about, but it's a portrait of Gala, his wife. And you look at it, and the image of Gala comes out pretty clearly. But then when you look closer, you realize that Gala isn't really there. This image that we're seeing, which is clearly of this brunette woman, is actually just all a series of spheres lined up in such a way as to create the image of the face of a woman. And it is amazing. That's why, for me personally, I'm like, why is Persistence of Memory considered to be his greatest work? I just look at these other things and they astound me. I could spend a long time looking at this portrait of Gala and trying to figure out how Dali arranged the spheres in such a way as to create this particular image. But for us, one of the ways that we can understand this particular portrait is that it's an artistic response to a scientific discovery. It's a really cool representation of how we think we're made up out of solid matter, but if you look closely enough, we're not. All right, Galatea of the Spheres. So Gala and Dali both lived a nice long life. Salvador lived to see the end of the 1980s, and so he saw a lot transpire over the course of the 20th century. He lived through 2 world wars, he lived through the Spanish Civil War, and he also lived through the 60s. Salvador Dali spent a lot of time in the United States of America. One of my favorite stories of Dali, when he came to New York City for the first time, he wanted to be Dali. He wanted to be a surrealist, so he wanted to do things that would make people sort of turn their heads. And so to do this, on his first day in New York City, he got a very large piece of French bread. So it was like a piece of French bread that was like 6 feet long, and he put it on his shoulder, and he just wanted to walk through downtown New York City. So here's Dali with his weird mustache and a huge piece of bread over his shoulder, walking through downtown New York City. I don't know specifically when this was. Is this the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s? I don't know when it was. But Dali said that he did this and that he was really annoyed because New Yorkers didn't even give him a second thought. They didn't look at him. They didn't bother with him. New Yorkers were so busy. They were so caught up in their own lives. And also, things are always so crazy in New York City that this world famous surrealist couldn't even get people's attention. So for Dali, it was hard to be a surrealist in New York City because New York is sort of all surreal. Okay, so let me take it to the 60s now. So when the 1960s roll around and we've got the Vietnam War and the counterculture movement and many young people experimenting with drugs, especially hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, psilocybin, stuff like that, Dali's artwork was held up in high regard by the drug-using young people of the counterculture because, well, for the obvious reason, this artwork looks like something that was inspired by drugs. I mean, especially when the artwork has names like the hallucinogenic Toreador, Dali's artwork looks like visions that come from a drug-induced hallucination. And so Dali, at some point in time in the 1960s, was asked about this. And again, I apologize. I've tried to find the exact source of this quote, and I can't, but I do have confirmation that Dali actually said it. And it's a great quote, and it's one that I love sharing with students. But Dali was asked point blank, "Do you use drugs?" To which Dali responded, and I love this quote, "I don't need drugs. I am drugs." Dali was known for his quick wit and his comebacks. In fact, the other Dali museum that I've been to, I haven't been to the one in Spain. I've never been to Spain. But also in the 90s, I was at the Dali Museum in Paris, in the Montmartre neighborhood. And in that Dali museum, there's a whole list of his one-liners. There's like a wall in the museum with like portraits of him. And next to each portrait was one of his one-liners, these witty comebacks that he gave to questions that people asked him. And this is a great example of his wit. And I, of course, always like sharing it with you guys because you may find yourself in a particular situation, if you haven't already, where you might feel yourself peer pressured to try drugs. You might be at a party, somebody offers you a joint or something like this. And if you need an out, if you need something to say so that you don't have to participate, I think this is a great quote. Just say this: "I don't need drugs, I am drugs." And maybe give the person who's offering you the drugs the same look that Dali is giving us here in this portrait. That would probably help for effect. And then just get up and leave. So there you go. I don't need drugs. I am drugs. A great out for you personally. And that's it for my personal public service announcement. Our last modernist. Let's talk about a musician, the Russian-born Igor Stravinsky. Originally from Russia, came to Paris, France, which is where he, I believe, spent most of his time. And Stravinsky gave us probably the best example of modern art in music with his 1913 ballet composition, The Rite of Spring. So if the point of modern art is to reject anything traditional, boy, does The Rite of Spring do it. And in fact, that's what Igor Stravinsky set out to do. He wanted to take all traditional notions of harmony and replace it with cacophony. Particular chords that don't sound well together, he is going to put those chords together. He is intentionally striving to create music that most people aren't going to feel is actually music. It just doesn't sound right. It sounds like noise. Now, this is the music, The Rite of Spring. And then there's the ballet. There are the dancers, dancing in such a way as to tell the story of the song. And the ballet itself is equally as primal or as savage, because it featured people who look very non-Western, very uncivilized, very savage. And Stravinsky, as well as the choreographer Nijinsky, they wanted these people to act as if they didn't have a soul, so that they would come out onto stage. The music is wild. The music is very percussive. It's very non-traditional, but it is very energetic. And the dancers start responding to that energy as if they are sort of hypnotized by it. And they engage in these particular rituals in response to the music. And this was to be The Rite of Spring as it premiered in 1913. But the premiere is one of the greatest stories in modernist history because the premiere didn't last for very long. People started rioting during the premiere of The Rite of Spring in Paris, France in 1913. Now, what exactly went down is hard to know because there are conflicting accounts about what people saw. But there was yelling, there was screaming, there were fights, things were thrown. Stravinsky himself got the performers, and they hid backstage while the chaos ensued among the crowd. So The Rite of Spring, in its premiere, did not get a full performance because it was essentially shut down by rioting. I don't know exactly how long they got into The Rite of Spring. Maybe that information is out there. I haven't been able to find it. I like to compare The Rite of Spring premiere in Paris, France in 1913 with the first rock and roll concert, which was in Cleveland, Ohio in 1952, which is why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is in Cleveland. Rock and roll wasn't developed in Cleveland, but the first rock and roll concert was in Cleveland in March of 1952. And that concert lasted a whole of 2 minutes before the police shut it down. And these are both just great examples of a new form of music that comes around. People don't understand it. There's wild and crazy dancing that's happening in during both of those historical events, and just a perfect example of modernism. Now, the interesting thing about The Rite of Spring is it goes on to be so inspirational. So Stravinsky just said, when he started off writing The Rite of Spring, or what his attitude was at least, was, I'm going to take everything traditional and I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to intentionally break the rules. He wanted to create something wild or primal or savage. So in order to do that, the music was highly percussive and full of energy, which probably did a lot to, provoke the riot. So whereas the actual premiere was a disaster, the influence of this song was long-lasting. So just as Cézanne in the late 19th century had broken all the rules of art, but in so doing opened art up to all these new things that could be done in art. That's what Stravinsky did with music, because people would continue to listen to The Rite of Spring. They would challenge their ears. And here's what happened. They got used to it, and it ended up sounding really good to people. So just like how Cézanne opened up art, Stravinsky opens up music. Now musicians can start doing these wild things in music. And what people once heard as noise, as cacophony, as something that would make people shake their head and go, oh no, turn it off. This is awful. This isn't music. After repeated listening, people are like, that's kind of good. That's kind of interesting. Wow, I actually really like this. And for me, That's the greatest testimony to the power of modernism. Because when it comes to music and the arts, we like what's familiar. There's something comfortable with what's familiar. But sometimes, just sometimes, when you challenge yourself with something unfamiliar and you look at it enough or you listen to it enough and you start to get used to it, then you start to appreciate it. You even start to like it, and maybe even like it more than what you once liked. And that's sort of the story of the Rite of Spring and modernism. So if I can go all the way back to one of the first things I said about modernism in terms of how I introduced it, it was with this. Here is our great German-American cultural historian Peter Gay in his definition of modernism. He defined modernism as the lure of heresy, which is a great definition, but I want to give you another way of thinking about modernism, because this definition, it sort of places the work of modern art in relation to the things of the past. So when the modernist artist comes around, be it Baudelaire or Igor Stravinsky or Cézanne, according to Peter Gay, what they are doing is they are enticed, they are lured by the excitement of doing something bad. They are going to reject tradition. Now, the other way to think about it is to think about what that modern artist is doing for the future. Cézanne opened up art so that we could have Cubism. Stravinsky opened up the world of 20th century music so we could have all sorts of wild forms of music. So the modernist artist isn't just rejecting the past. That modern artist is opening up the future. So now, to finish up, if you don't mind, one last digression on my part. For me, this is how I personally think about modern art and what it does to the future. I think of the 1980s movie Back to the Future. This movie, which came out in 1985, is still very popular today. But if you haven't seen it, it's the story of a teenager in 1985 named Marty McFly who enjoys skateboarding and playing the electric guitar. And he goes back in time, 30 years, to 1955, where he has to make sure that his mom and dad meet, kiss, fall in love so that they go on and get married and he can be born. And near the end of the movie, when Marty McFly is still in the 1950s, he ends up playing guitar at a high school dance where his parents kiss for the first time. And while playing at the high school dance, and he's playing the Chuck Berry song Johnny Be Good, he breaks out into this heavy metal riff, which was very popular in the 1980s, inspired by bands like, Van Halen and Def Leppard and other big heavy metal bands from the 80s. And Marty McFly begins rocking out his guitar in this heavy metal riff. And then in this comedic part of the movie, he stops playing and he looks out at the crowd and all these teenagers are looking at him in stunned silence. What the heck was that? We certainly can't dance to it. And Marty McFly walks up to the microphone and says, I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet, but your kids are going to love it. For me, that's modernism. And this finally concludes my lecture on modernism. Hey, boy, we learned a lot in this one. I hope you enjoyed it. And hey, if during the end of this lecture you were wondering, this Igor Stravinsky, Rite of Spring stuff, what did it actually sound like? Well, allow me to shut up and let the Rite of Spring take over. Have a wonderful day, Euro Bears. I'll see you in the class.
I think it's a masterpiece.